For many players, Stardew Valley represents a gentle escape from the complexities of modern life, a place where crops grow, fish bite, and seasons turn with comforting predictability. But beneath this pastoral surface, hidden in the darkness of ancient mines and forgotten caverns, lies a history soaked in conflict, tragedy, and mysteries that span millennia. This is not a story of pleasant harvests or friendly townsfolk. This is a story of war, of civilizations clashing in the eternal night beneath the earth, of technology and shadow, of grudges that have festered for 1,000 years. This is the story of the elemental wars. Deep below the valley, far beyond the reach of sunlight, two ancient civilizations once thrived in the subterranean darkness. The dwarves, a people of stone and metal, of advanced technology and fierce pride, and the shadow people, beings of darkness and mystery, inhabitants of the void itself. These two peoples, so different in nature and origin, would become locked in a conflict so devastating, so prolonged, that its echoes still reverberate through the caverns today. To understand this war, we must first understand who these peoples were, where they came from, and what drove them to such bitter enmity. The dwarves are perhaps one of the most enigmatic civilizations ever to exist in the known world. When you first encounter the dwarf in the mines, past that impenetrable stone barrier, you meet not just a merchant, but the last remnant of an entire culture. A culture that once possessed technology far beyond anything the Ferngil Republic has achieved. A culture that built wonders in the darkness. A culture that has been reduced to a single shopkeeper selling explosives and preserves. But who were the dwarves? Where did they come from? And how did a civilization so advanced fall so far? The most compelling theory about dwarven origins comes from a lost book that can be found and donated to the museum, written by an author named M. Jasper. In his work titled Mysteries of the Dwarves, Jasper proposes something extraordinary. He suggests that the dwarves are not native to this world at all. He theorizes that they are, in fact, an alien civilization, travelers from a distant star who came to this planet long ago. According to Jasper's hypothesis, the dwarves originated from a world with a much thicker atmosphere than Earth, one that protected them from the harsh radiation of their home star. This would explain their preference for living underground, away from the direct sunlight that other species find so vital. On their original world, they would have been surface dwellers, but here, on this planet with its thinner atmosphere and brighter sun, the underground became their only viable habitat. The theory of an extraterrestrial origin gains further credibility when you examine the archaeological evidence scattered throughout the valley. The dwarven technology found in the mines is not primitive. It's not the crude tools of a Stone Age people learning to work metal. It's sophisticated, advanced, and in many cases, completely beyond the understanding of modern engineers. The dwarf themselves speaks of this when you've befriended them enough. They say, "Long ago, my people knew the secrets of advanced technology. The archaeological evidence proves that. But I wonder where it came from, and where did it all go? I guess some questions will never be answered." This melancholy reflection reveals a people who have lost not just their civilization, but their very knowledge. They remember that they were once great, but the how and why have been lost to time. If we accept the alien hypothesis, then the arrival of the dwarves on this world must have been catastrophic. Imagine a spacecraft traveling through the void of space, carrying the hopes and dreams of an entire civilization. Perhaps they were explorers, seeking new worlds to study. Perhaps they were colonists, looking for a new home after some disaster befell their original planet. Or perhaps they were refugees, fleeing from some unimaginable threat. Whatever their purpose, something went terribly wrong. The ship, whether due to mechanical failure, collision with debris, or some other calamity, plummeted from the sky and crashed deep into the earth. The impact would have been devastating, burying the vessel and its passengers miles beneath the surface. The survivors, those who lived through the initial crash, would have found themselves trapped in an alien world, cut off from the surface, surrounded by rock and darkness. But the dwarves were not a people to surrender to despair. They were engineers, builders, technologists. They assessed their situation and they adapted. Using whatever remained of their advanced technology, they began to carve out a new existence in the subterranean depths. They discovered that this planet, while hostile to them in some ways, was rich in resources. The rock around them contained veins of precious metals and gems, materials they could use to repair their technology, to build new structures, to create a civilization in the darkness. Over time, what began as a desperate survival effort transformed into something more permanent. The dwarves became miners, delving deeper and deeper into the earth, discovering vast networks of natural caverns that they expanded and transformed into cities, workshops, and fortresses. Their technology evolved, adapting to their new environment. Where once they might have had spacecraft and energy weapons, now they created mining equipment, excavation tools, and devices powered by the geothermal energy of the planet's core. The evidence of this dwarven golden age can still be found throughout the valley if you know where to look. In the mines themselves, you can discover ancient dwarven artifacts, pieces of technology that still function after centuries or millennia of abandonment. The dwarven gadget, a complex mechanical device whose purpose remains unclear to modern observers. Scrolls written in the dwarven language, containing knowledge that requires a special translation guide to decipher. And perhaps most intriguingly, on Ginger Island, in the volcano dungeon, you can find extensive ruins of dwarven civilization. These ruins paint a picture of a culture at its height. Flying automatons, powered by precious gems, that still patrol the ancient halls. Storage chests that utilize the volcano's heat to maintain their contents. Elaborate structures built into the very rock of the volcano itself, designed to withstand extreme heat and geological instability. These were not the works of a primitive people struggling to survive. These were the achievements of master engineers who had conquered their environment and bent it to their will. The dwarven cities in their prime must have been marvels to behold. Imagine vast caverns, their ceilings lost in shadow, illuminated not by torches or lanterns, but by softly glowing crystals embedded in the walls. Streets paved with polished stone, lined with workshops where dwarven artisans crafted tools and devices of remarkable precision. Great foundries where raw ore was transformed into refined metal, powered by tapping directly into underground magma flows. Libraries containing the accumulated knowledge of their people, both from their home world and from their new life beneath the earth. And at the center of it all, perhaps, the remains of their original spacecraft, transformed from a vehicle of travel into a monument, a reminder of where they came from and how far they had journeyed. But the dwarves, for all their technological prowess, were not alone in the darkness. They shared the subterranean world with another civilization, one far older and far stranger than they could have imagined. The Shadow People. The Shadow People, also known as Void Spirits, are beings that defy easy understanding. They are not flesh and bone like humans or dwarves. They are creatures of darkness itself, entities that exist on the boundary between the physical world and something else, something beyond our normal comprehension. When you first encounter shadow people in the mines, they appear as hostile creatures, shadow brutes that attack on sight. But this hostility, as you later learn from Krobus, is not their natural state. It is a response to centuries of war, of being hunted and driven from their homes. To truly understand the shadow people, you must understand not just what they are, but where they came from. According to Krobus, the one friendly shadow person you can meet in the sewers, his people did not originate on the physical plane of existence. They came from somewhere else, somewhere he refers to simply as the void. This void is not just empty space or darkness. It is another dimension, another realm of reality where the laws of physics as we understand them do not fully apply. The shadow people lived in this void, existing as purely spiritual or energy-based beings, free from the constraints of physical form. But something happened, something that Krobus describes as a great catastrophe. This catastrophe, whatever its nature, forced the shadow people to flee the void and cross over into the physical plane, into the material world where Stardew Valley exists. The nature of this catastrophe remains one of the great mysteries of the valley's lore. Krobus speaks of it vaguely, suggesting it may be more myth than history, something passed down through generations until the true details were lost. Was it a natural disaster in the void, some kind of dimensional collapse or instability that made their home uninhabitable? Was it an attack by some other entity, some threat even more terrifying than what they would face in the physical world? Or was it something else entirely, perhaps a consequence of the shadow people's own actions or experiments? We may never know the full truth. What we do know is that the crossing from the void to the physical plane was not easy. It required the shadow people to take on physical forms, or at least semi-physical ones. They became beings of living shadow, creatures that could interact with the material world but remained fundamentally different from purely physical beings like humans or dwarves. The physical plane presented immediate challenges for the shadow people. Chief among these was light. In the void, there had been no light as we understand it. But in this world, the sun shone with terrible brightness. Exposure to direct sunlight was not just uncomfortable for the shadow people, it was dangerous, potentially lethal. They could not survive on the surface. They had no choice but to seek refuge underground, in the deep places where sunlight never reached, where the darkness provided protection and comfort. And so they descended into the earth, into the vast network of natural caverns that honeycombed the planet's crust. These deep places became their new home, the place they would come to call their ancestral homeland. The Shadow People's society, as best we can piece together from the limited evidence available, was complex and hierarchical. There were different types of shadow people, each with their own roles and abilities. The shadow brutes, large and powerful, served as warriors and defenders. The shadow shamans possessed magical abilities, capable of casting hexes and curses. There were others as well, different forms adapted to different purposes. Despite their fearsome appearance and their hostility toward intruders in the mines, the shadow people were not inherently violent or evil. They were a civilization with culture, traditions, and social structures. Krobus himself is proof of this. He runs a shop, trades fairly, appreciates gifts, and is capable of friendship and even living peacefully as a roommate with the player. The aggression displayed by the shadow people in the mines is not their natural behavior. It is a response to perceived threats, a defensive mechanism born from centuries of conflict and persecution. For a time, perhaps centuries or even millennia, the shadow people lived alone in the deep underground. They adapted to their new environment, created communities in the darkness, and began to heal from whatever trauma had driven them from the void. The deep earth, far from the surface world, became their sanctuary. They were safe here, or so they believed. The caverns provided everything they needed. Mineral formations gave them shelter. Underground water sources sustained them. The darkness itself was their comfort and protection. They were survivors of catastrophe, rebuilding their civilization in a new and strange world. They had escaped one disaster. Surely here, in the deepest depths where no surface dweller would ever venture, they could finally find peace. But peace was not to be their destiny. The exact moment when the dwarves first encountered the shadow people is lost to history. Perhaps it happened gradually as dwarven miners, always pushing deeper and expanding their territory, began to break through into caverns that the shadow people had long claimed as their own. Or perhaps it was sudden, a chance meeting in some deep tunnel, two civilizations coming face to face for the first time, neither knowing what to make of the other. What is certain is that the initial contact did not lead to peace. Whether due to miscommunication, fear, competition for resources, or simple territorial instinct, relations between the dwarves and shadow people quickly deteriorated. Small skirmishes became larger conflicts. Isolated incidents became patterns of violence. And before either side fully understood what was happening, they were at war. The causes of the elemental wars are disputed to this day. Ask the dwarf, and they will tell you that the shadow people drove their ancestors from their homes, that dwarven families were killed, that entire settlements were destroyed by shadow attacks. The dwarf speaks with genuine pain and anger when discussing the conflict, mentioning that their own family died in the war. This is not abstract history to them. This is personal trauma, loss that still feels fresh despite the passage of time. From the dwarven perspective, they were the victims, peaceful miners and craftspeople who were attacked without provocation by hostile creatures emerging from the darkness. They fought, they say, in self-defense to protect their cities and their people from annihilation. But ask Krobus, and you hear a very different story. Krobus states clearly that the dwarves drove the shadow people from their ancestral homeland. He speaks of dwarven aggression, of his people being forced to flee deeper and deeper into the earth as dwarven expansion consumed territory that the shadow people had occupied for generations. From the shadow people's perspective, they were the victims, peaceful inhabitants of the deep earth who were invaded by foreign entities with superior technology. They fought, they say, to defend their homes, to protect their communities from being wiped out by dwarven mining operations that showed no respect for shadow territory or shadow lives. So which version is true? Were the dwarves the aggressors, or were they the victims? The answer, as is so often the case with long and bitter conflicts, is probably both. And neither. The reality of the elemental wars was likely far more complex than either side's simplified narrative admits. Consider the circumstances. The dwarves, if we accept the alien crash theory, were themselves refugees, strangers in a strange land, desperate to survive and rebuild. Their mining operations were not acts of conquest for conquest's sake. They were survival, the extraction of resources necessary to maintain their technology and their way of life. As their population grew and their needs expanded, they pushed deeper and wider into the underground, not out of malice but out of necessity. To them, the caverns they were mining were simply unexplored territory, resources to be claimed and utilized. But to the shadow people, those same caverns were home. They had lived there for centuries or millennia, since fleeing the void. These were not empty tunnels waiting to be colonized. They were occupied territory, the ancestral homeland that Krobus speaks of. When dwarven miners broke through into shadow settlements, it wasn't exploration to the shadow people. It was invasion. When dwarven excavations caused cave-ins that destroyed shadow dwellings or blocked traditional shadow pathways, it wasn't unfortunate accidents. It was violence. And when the shadow people responded with force, defending their territory from these strange technological beings who showed no signs of stopping or negotiating, the dwarves saw it not as defense but as unprovoked attack. This is how wars begin, not with clear villains and heroes, but with two groups who both believe they are justified, both believe they are the victims, both believe they are fighting for survival. Add to this the fundamental differences between the two peoples. The dwarves were beings of matter and technology. The shadow people were beings of darkness and spiritual energy. They literally existed in different states of reality, making communication difficult if not impossible. How do you negotiate with beings who can phase through walls, who see in ways you cannot comprehend, who fear the very light you use to see by? How do you find common ground with entities who speak only in mechanical efficiency, whose bodies are solid and inflexible, whose technology tears through your homeland like it's nothing but empty space? And so the war began. And once it began, it did not stop. The elemental wars lasted for approximately 1,000 years. Let that sink in. 1,000 years. 40 generations of humans. 1,000 years of conflict, of violence, of death. 1,000 years where children on both sides grew up knowing nothing but war, where the original causes of the conflict became irrelevant because all that mattered was the accumulated weight of suffering and vengeance. The war was called the Elemental Wars, and that name hints at the nature of the conflict. This was not just physical combat. This was a war that involved the fundamental forces of nature, the manipulation of elements, the unleashing of powers that reshaped the very geology of the underground. The dwarves brought their technology to bear. They created weapons of terrible efficiency, explosives that could collapse entire caverns, burying shadow people by the hundreds. Mining lasers repurposed as weapons of war, capable of cutting through stone and shadow flesh alike. Automated defenses, mechanical guardians that patrolled dwarven territories and attacked any shadow people on sight. They fortified their cities, building massive stone doors and barriers, creating kill zones where shadow attackers would be funneled into areas where dwarven weapons could decimate them. They used their knowledge of engineering to reshape the underground to their advantage, redirecting underground rivers to flood shadow strongholds, triggering deliberate earthquakes to collapse enemy positions. The shadow people responded with their own unique capabilities. They could move through darkness with incredible speed, appearing behind dwarven lines without warning. They could phase through physical barriers that the dwarves thought impenetrable, striking at the heart of dwarven cities before defenders could respond. The shadow shamans wielded powerful magic, curses that could cause dwarven technology to malfunction, hexes that brought madness and despair. They could extinguish lights, plunging dwarven settlements into darkness where the shadow people held every advantage. Some theories suggest they could even manipulate the void itself, creating portals or tiers in reality that allowed them to move vast distances instantly or trap dwarven forces in pocket dimensions from which there was no escape. The battles must have been apocalyptic in scale. Imagine the volcanic regions of Ginger Island during the height of the conflict. Dwarven fortresses built into the very walls of the volcano, their defenses glowing with energy. Shadow people emerging from every crack and crevice, waves of darkness crashing against technological barriers like a tide of living night. The air filled with the sound of explosions, the crackle of energy weapons, the screams of the dying from both sides. Magma being weaponized, channeled, and directed to burn away shadow forces. Shadow magic causing volcanic eruptions, turning the dwarves' own fortifications into death traps. The very landscape being transformed by the violence, tunnels collapsing, new caverns being blasted into existence, underground lakes boiling away or new ones forming from breached aquifers. And through it all, the death toll mounted. Entire dwarven settlements were wiped out, their inhabitants killed to the last, their technology looted or destroyed. Shadow communities were exterminated, their people hunted down and eliminated with systematic efficiency. Neither side held back. Neither side showed mercy, because in their minds they couldn't afford to. This wasn't a war over resources anymore. This wasn't about territory. This was about survival. Each side believed, genuinely believed, that if they did not fight with everything they had, if they did not push for total victory, then their entire civilization would be annihilated. And so the war ground on year after year, decade after decade, century after century. The war affected not just the combatants, but the entire subterranean ecosystem. The monsters that now inhabit the mines, the various slimes and bats and other creatures, may well be the mutated or magically altered descendants of more ordinary creatures that were caught in the crossfire. The elemental nature of the war, the massive energies being thrown around by both sides, would have had profound effects on the local environment. Creatures exposed to dwarven radiation or shadow magic would have changed, adapted, become something new and often more dangerous. The geothermal energy that powers some of the remaining dwarven artifacts in the volcano ruins might be residual power from war machines. The strange properties of some of the deeper caverns, areas where gravity seems slightly off or where sounds echo strangely, might be lasting distortions from reality-warping shadow magic. As the centuries passed, both civilizations paid a terrible price. The dwarven population, never large to begin with after the crash, was decimated. Entire generations of dwarven engineers and craftspeople died in the war, and with them died knowledge. The secrets of the most advanced technology were lost when the specialists who understood them were killed. Dwarven cities fell one by one, either to shadow attacks or abandoned when they became indefensible. The dwarves were forced to consolidate, to retreat, to give up territory they had once held. Their great civilization, which had once spanned vast regions of the underground and even extended to places like the volcano regions of distant islands, began to collapse inward, contracting, dying. The Shadow People fared no better. Whatever population they had managed to build after fleeing the void was shattered by the war. The organized society that Krobus hints at, with its communities and traditions, was broken apart. Shadow People were scattered, driven into the deepest and most remote caverns, places where even desperate dwarven forces wouldn't pursue them. Many were killed. Many more were cut off from other survivors, isolated in darkness, reverting to a more primitive state. The Shadow People in the mines that attack the player on sight are not sophisticated members of a functional civilization. They are the traumatized, often feral descendants of war survivors, beings who have known nothing but violence for so long that it has become their default response to any intrusion. And then, somehow, the war ended, not with a great climactic battle, not with a peace treaty signed by leaders of both sides, not with a clear victor emerging triumphant. The war simply stopped. By the time of Stardew Valley's present day, as the wizard tells us, the elemental wars have long been finished. But when exactly did they end? And how? These questions have no clear answers. What we know is that both civilizations were exhausted, reduced to mere shadows, pun intended, of what they once were. Perhaps they reached a point where neither side had the strength to continue fighting. Perhaps the leadership on both sides finally came to the realization that if the war continued, there would be no survivors at all. Or perhaps, and this is the darkest possibility, perhaps they simply ran out of targets. Perhaps each side inflicted so much damage on the other that there were no longer enough of either population left to field armies. The aftermath of the elemental wars is visible throughout the valley if you know how to look. The mine that the player explores is not natural. Its structure, the elevator shafts, the organized levels, these are remnants of dwarven engineering. But it's also been abandoned, left to decay, partially reclaimed by nature and by the monsters that now infest it. The dwarven ruins on Ginger Island show a civilization at its height, but they are ruins, empty and lifeless save for a few automated guardians still mindlessly following their last orders. The Shadow People have fared even worse. They have no ruins, no monuments. Their civilization has been reduced to hostile monsters in the darkness and one friendly merchant hiding in the sewers. When you meet the dwarf in the mines, you are not meeting a representative of a thriving culture. You are meeting a survivor, perhaps the last survivor or one of very few. The dwarf sells items, runs a shop, tries to maintain some semblance of normal life, but they are isolated, alone, surrounded by the remnants of their people's former glory but unable to rebuild it. When they speak of their people's ancient technology, there is longing in their voice and loss. They know what they once were. They can see the evidence of it all around them, but they cannot recreate it. The knowledge is gone. The population is gone. All that remains is memory and ruins and one lonely shopkeeper in a mine. Krobus is, if anything, in an even more tragic position. At least the dwarf has a legitimate business location, a place in the mines where they can openly exist. Krobus lives in the sewers. He is literally hiding in waste tunnels beneath the town, coming out only at night, careful not to be seen by most humans who would likely react to him with fear or violence. He sells rare goods, yes, but his inventory is limited and his customer base consists of exactly one person, the player. He is desperately lonely, as his dialogue reveals. He wants friendship, wants companionship, wants some kind of connection. But he is also afraid, deeply afraid. He fears that if the dwarf learns of his location, an assassin would be sent. He fears that the war, though officially over, might resume at any moment. He carries the trauma of 1,000 years of conflict, and it has left him paranoid and isolated, unable to trust, unable to fully live even though the fighting has stopped. The most dramatic illustration of the lasting enmity between these two peoples comes in the form of a cut scene that can be triggered once you've achieved sufficient friendship with both Krobus and the dwarf. If you've earned 50 friendship points with the dwarf and purchased the star drop from Krobus, the game triggers a confrontation. The dwarf, having somehow learned of Krobus's location, enters the sewers. This is not a friendly visit. The dwarf is there for blood. They confront Krobus directly, accusing him of the deaths of dwarven people, of dwarven families. The dwarf's pain is raw and real. To them, Krobus is not an individual. He is a representative of the Shadow People as a whole, and therefore he is guilty of every crime the Shadow People committed during the war. It doesn't matter that Krobus may not have personally killed anyone, or that he clearly wants peace. To the dwarf, a shadow person is a shadow person, and Shadow People killed dwarven families. Krobus responds in kind. He blames the dwarves for driving the Shadow People from their ancestral homeland, for starting the war in the first place. He sees the dwarf not as an individual with legitimate grievances, but as a representative of the oppressor, the invader, the one responsible for the near extinction of Shadow People. He too carries pain, trauma, loss. Both of them are victims. Both of them have lost people they loved. Both of them carry scars from a war that neither of them started but both of them suffered through. And they begin to fight. In the sewers, these two last remnants of their respective civilizations, two survivors of a 1,000-year war, are about to kill each other, to continue the cycle of violence that has already destroyed everything they once knew. The elemental wars might have officially ended, but in this moment, it is clear that the war is not over. Cannot be over as long as the hate remains, as long as the pain is unresolved, as long as each side sees the other not as people but as the enemy. Then something miraculous happens. The wizard appears. Rasmodius, the enigmatic magic user who serves as a bridge between many of the valley's mysteries, intervenes. He does not take sides. He does not assign blame. He simply states a fact. The elemental wars have long been finished. It is time to let go. It is time for peace. The wizard, who has lived through or at least studied much of the valley's history, understands what Krobus and the dwarf, in their pain, cannot see, that continuing the cycle of revenge will not bring back what was lost. It will only ensure that there are no survivors at all. If Krobus and the dwarf kill each other here, then that may well be the end of both civilizations forever. The last dwarf, the last free shadow person, gone, over a conflict that neither of them had any power to prevent or stop. The wizard casts what he calls a seal of promise. This is not mind control. This is not forcing them to like each other. It is a binding, a magical enforcement of a truce. Krobus and the dwarf agree, reluctantly, painfully, to not harm each other. The seal makes this agreement binding, preventing them from acting on their impulses for vengeance. It is a fragile peace, built not on forgiveness or understanding but on simple exhaustion and the intervention of a third party. But it is peace. For the first time in 1,000 years, a dwarf and a shadow person agree to coexist without violence. This moment is pivotal in the valley's hidden lore. It represents the possibility of healing, of breaking cycles of violence that seem eternal. It shows that even the deepest hatreds can be set aside, if not overcome. Krobus and the dwarf will never be friends. The seal of promise ensures they won't kill each other, but it cannot make them like each other. Their dialogue after this event makes it clear that they remain wary, suspicious, still nursing their respective grievances. But they are no longer actively trying to destroy one another. And in the context of their people's history, that is everything. That is the first step toward ensuring that both of their civilizations, as reduced and damaged as they are, might have a future. The player's role in all of this is significant. You are the catalyst for this peace, however fragile. By befriending both Krobus and the dwarf, by treating both of them as individuals worthy of respect and kindness, you demonstrate an alternative to the cycle of hatred. You are proof that it is possible to see past old divisions, to extend friendship even to those who are traditionally enemies. Neither Krobus nor the dwarf could have made peace on their own. Their trauma runs too deep, their pain too fresh despite the centuries. They needed an outside perspective, someone who did not carry the baggage of the elemental wars, someone who could see them as people rather than as representatives of ancient enmities. This theme of the player as bridge builder, as healer of old wounds, resonates throughout Stardew Valley's lore. You restore the community center, bringing the town together. You can help resolve family dramas, mend relationships, bring people closer. And in the case of the elemental wars, you are literally preventing extinction. Without your intervention, without your friendship with both parties, the cutscene would never trigger. Krobus and the dwarf might live out their lives in ignorance of each other, or they might eventually meet and fight without the wizard's intervention. Either way, the story of their peoples would end in isolation or violence. Because of you, there is another option. The question of what happens next is one that Stardew Valley leaves unanswered. With the seal of promise in place, Krobus and the dwarf are prevented from harming each other. But what does that mean for the future? Are there other dwarves hidden in the depths that we never meet? Are there other shadow people besides Krobus who retain their intelligence and culture? Could there be someday a rebuilding? Could these two peoples, reduced though they are, find a way to not just coexist but cooperate? The game offers hints of possibility. If you choose to have Krobus move in as a roommate, he adapts to life on the surface, albeit with limitations due to his sensitivity to light. He learns to live alongside a human, to trust, to form bonds. If a shadow person and a human can live together peacefully, is it so impossible to imagine a dwarf and shadow person doing the same? The legacy of the elemental wars extends beyond just Krobus and the dwarf. The entire underground ecosystem of Stardew Valley has been shaped by this conflict. The mines that the player explores are, in essence, a graveyard. Every level is a layer of history, of civilization built and destroyed. The resources you extract, the ore and gems and coal, these are the materials that two civilizations fought over for a millennium. When you fight the monsters in the mines, you are encountering the descendants or remnants of that war. The shadow brutes that attack you are not doing so out of pure evil. They are doing so because for generations, their species has known nothing but war, and any intrusion into their territory is perceived as a threat. They have become, through centuries of conflict, exactly what they needed to be to survive. Aggressive, dangerous, unwilling to give quarter. The deeper you go in the mines and later in the Skull Cavern, the more evidence you find of the scale of the devastation. The dangerous monsters, the strange environmental effects, the ruins and ancient technology scattered about, all of it points to a war that fundamentally transformed the underground. The Skull Cavern in particular, with its seemingly infinite depth and its extremely dangerous inhabitants, might represent the deepest battlegrounds of the war, places where the fighting was so intense and the energies unleashed so powerful that reality itself was damaged. The serpents and mummies and other horrors found there are not natural creatures. They are the products of 1,000 years of magical and technological warfare, mutations and summonings and experiments gone wrong, now left to inhabit the ruins of civilizations that no longer exist to control them. For players who pay attention to the lore, the elemental wars add a layer of depth and melancholy to the otherwise cheerful experience of Stardew Valley. Every trip into the mines becomes a journey through history, through the remnants of conflict that claimed untold lives, over uncountable generations. Every interaction with Krobus or the dwarf takes on new weight when you understand the trauma they carry, the losses they have suffered. The simple act of being kind to them, of offering gifts and friendship, becomes not just a game mechanic but a meaningful choice to acknowledge their pain and offer something different. The elemental wars also serve as a cautionary tale, one that resonates with real-world conflicts. This is a war where both sides believed they were right, where both sides had legitimate grievances, where both sides committed atrocities in the name of survival and justice. Neither side was purely good or purely evil. They were just people, or at least intelligent beings, trying to survive in a world that felt hostile. And in their fear and desperation, they destroyed each other. The parallels to human history are obvious and intentional. How many real-world conflicts have followed this same pattern? How many wars have been fought where each side claims victimhood, where each side has reasons for their actions, where the cycle of violence perpetuates itself across generations until nobody remembers how it started or why? The elemental wars are fictional, but the human experiences they reflect are very real. The underground world of Stardew Valley, then, is not just a gameplay area where you mine for resources and fight monsters. It is a memorial, a vast and largely forgotten graveyard where two civilizations bled themselves to the point of extinction. The silence in the deep mines is not peaceful. It is the silence of ending, of loss, of potential never realized. When you walk through the volcanic ruins on Ginger Island and see the remnants of dwarven technology, you are seeing what could have been. A civilization that might have thrived, that might have achieved wonders, reduced to empty ruins and malfunctioning automatons. When you encounter shadow brutes in the darkness, you are seeing what the shadow people have been reduced to. A species that fled catastrophe in the void only to be nearly wiped out in the physical plane. Their culture and society destroyed, their survivors scattered and often mindless with trauma and rage. And yet, despite all this tragedy, there is hope. The simple fact that Krobus exists, that he is sane and peaceful and capable of friendship, proves that the shadow people can recover. The fact that the dwarf maintains their shop, speaks to you, shares their history, proves that the dwarven spirit is not entirely broken. The seal of promise, imperfect and externally imposed though it is, proves that peace is possible. Not easy, not natural, not without help and intervention, but possible. The elemental wars destroyed two civilizations, but they did not succeed in destroying every last member of either species. As long as survivors exist, the possibility of rebuilding exists. As long as survivors can choose peace over continued violence, the future remains open. The player, in Stardew Valley's narrative, represents a new generation unburdened by old hatreds. You did not fight in the elemental wars. You do not carry personal trauma from those centuries of conflict. You can approach both Krobus and the dwarf with fresh eyes, seeing them for who they are as individuals rather than as representatives of ancient enemies. This gives you a unique position, a unique opportunity. You can choose to be the bridge. You can choose to show kindness to both sides, to refuse to perpetuate the cycle of blame and vengeance. And in doing so, you do more to heal the wounds of the elemental wars than any battle ever could. This is the deeper message hidden within this aspect of Stardew Valley's lore, that healing old wounds requires outside perspective, that cycles of violence can only be broken when people or beings choose to see each other as individuals rather than as representatives of groups they hate, that peace is always fragile, always requiring effort and often external support, but that it is always worth pursuing, that the alternative to peace, the continuation of old wars, leads only to mutual destruction. The elemental wars almost succeeded in wiping out both the dwarves and the shadow people. It was only exhaustion, the literal inability to continue fighting, that ended the conflict. If Krobus and the dwarf had found each other without the wizards' intervention, without the player's friendship with both, the war might have claimed its final two victims. Instead, there is now a chance, however small, for something better. The lasting impact of the elemental wars on the valley's present day cannot be overstated. The mines that provide so much of the player's income and resources are only accessible because the dwarves carved them out centuries ago. The monsters that provide combat challenges and resources are the descendants or products of wartime mutations and magical experiments. Krobus's shop in the sewers, which offers unique and valuable items, exists only because he is hiding from potential dwarven revenge. The dwarf's shop in the mines serves a similar purpose, a lone outpost of a dead civilization. Even the very geography of the underground has been shaped by the war. Collapsed tunnels that once connected major dwarven cities. Caverns expanded by explosives and combat. Underground rivers redirected by desperate engineering. The subterranean world is a scar, a permanent mark left by 1,000 years of violence. And perhaps most importantly, the elemental wars serve as a reminder that Stardew Valley's world is not a simple, uncomplicated fantasy. This is not a world where problems are easy and solutions are obvious. This is a world with deep history, with complex conflicts, with tragedies that cannot be simply fixed. The elemental wars cannot be undone. The thousands, perhaps millions, of dwarves and shadow people who died in the conflict cannot be brought back. The lost knowledge, the destroyed cities, the fractured cultures, these losses are permanent. All that can be done is to acknowledge the past, learn from it, and try to do better in the future. This is a mature, nuanced approach to storytelling, one that respects the player's intelligence and emotional depth. For players who take the time to piece together this story, who befriend both Krobus and the dwarf, who witness the confrontation in the sewers and the wizard's intervention, the experience is profound. It transforms the game from a simple farming simulator into something much richer. It adds weight to your actions. It makes the world feel lived in, real, full of history and consequence. It demonstrates that beneath the cheerful exterior of watering crops and petting animals, Stardew Valley contains genuine tragedy, genuine complexity, genuine questions about hate and forgiveness and the possibility of peace. The elemental wars are not the main story of Stardew Valley. Most players might never learn the details, might never piece together the full scope of what happened in the underground. But for those who do, it adds a dimension to the game that is unforgettable. The unanswered questions surrounding the elemental wars only add to their mystique. We do not know the exact year the war began or ended. We do not know how many dwarves and shadow people originally existed, or how many died in the conflict. We do not know the details of specific battles, the names of leaders, the turning points that might have changed the course of the war. We do not know if there are other survivors beyond Krobus and the few dwarves we encounter. We do not know what became of dwarven cities beyond the ruins on Ginger Island, or whether shadow people communities still exist in the deepest, most remote caverns where no one has explored. These gaps in knowledge are frustrating, but they also serve a purpose. They make the history feel real, feel ancient, feel like something that has genuinely been lost to time. Not all questions have answers. Not all stories have neat conclusions. Sometimes, all that remains is fragments, hints, ruins, and the testimony of traumatized survivors. The role of magic in the elemental wars deserves particular attention. This was not just a conventional war with weapons and tactics. This was a conflict that the wizard refers to as the elemental wars, suggesting that the fundamental forces of nature were involved. The shadow people's abilities, their capacity to manipulate darkness and void energy, their shamans' curses and hexes, all of this represents a form of magic that is deeply tied to their nature as beings who originated from another plane of reality. They were not just using magic as a tool. They were magic in a sense, or at least beings whose existence straddled the line between physical and mystical. The dwarves, by contrast, were creatures of technology and engineering. But their technology was so advanced that it might as well have been magic to anyone observing it. The ability to create flying automatons powered by gems, to tap geothermal energy with perfect efficiency, to create devices that still function after centuries or millennia without maintenance. All of this suggests a level of scientific achievement that borders on the supernatural. In a very real sense, the elemental wars were a clash between two different types of magic. Shadow magic versus technological magic. The spiritual versus the material. Beings of living darkness against beings of stone and metal. It is this fundamental incompatibility, this deep difference in the very nature of their existence, that made the conflict so brutal and so difficult to resolve. They were not just fighting over territory or resources. They were fighting as representatives of different ways of being, different states of reality. This elemental aspect of the war would have made it particularly devastating to the environment. When shadow shamans cast their reality-warping spells and dwarven engineers unleashed their most powerful weapons, the very fabric of the underground would have been stressed and damaged. This might explain some of the stranger features of the Skull Cavern and the deepest mines. Areas where the laws of physics seem slightly bent, where you feel like you're being watched by unseen presences, where the very air feels charged with residual energy. These could be scars from the war, places where so much magical and technological power was unleashed that the environment has never fully recovered. Walking through these areas, you are walking through old battlefields, places where reality itself was a casualty of conflict. The question of whether the war could reignite is one that hangs over Krobus and the dwarf's fragile peace. The seal of promise prevents them from directly harming each other, but it does not change their feelings. The dwarf still believes the shadow people are responsible for terrible crimes. Krobus still believes the dwarves are responsible for terrible crimes. If either of them discovered other members of their species, members not bound by the seal, what would happen? Would the old hatreds immediately reignite? Would we see a new generation of elemental wars, perhaps even more devastating because now both sides know exactly what the other is capable of? Or would the exhaustion that ended the first war, the simple brutal, understanding that continuation means extinction, prevent any resumption of hostilities? The wizard's role as peacekeeper is interesting. He does not reveal how he knows so much about the elemental wars, but his knowledge is clearly extensive. Was he alive during the war? Has he been alive for centuries or millennia, silently observing from his tower? Or has he simply made a study of the valley's history, piecing together the story from evidence and testimony? Either way, his intervention in the sewers shows that he considers preventing the resumption of the elemental wars to be part of his responsibility. He is not just a magic user who lives in the forest. He is a guardian, someone who takes active steps to prevent catastrophes. The fact that he can cast a binding spell powerful enough to enforce peace between ancient enemies suggests that his magical abilities are considerable, perhaps on a level that dwarven technology or shadow magic at their height could not match. This raises questions about the broader magical landscape of the Stardew Valley world. The wizard is clearly powerful, but is he unique? Are there other magic users of his caliber? Was there any magical intervention during the actual elemental wars, or did the magical community, if such a thing exists, simply stay out of the conflict? The fact that the war lasted 1,000 years suggests that no one successfully intervened during that time. Either there was no one powerful enough to do so, or those who could chose not to get involved. The wizard's intervention now, in the present day, might be motivated by the fact that these are the last survivors. During the war, when both populations were larger, interfering might have been futile or might have seemed like taking sides. Now, when both civilizations are on the brink of absolute extinction, the moral calculus is different. Saving Krobus and the dwarf is not about picking a side. It is about preventing the final, pointless deaths in a war that has already claimed more than enough victims. The artifacts and technology that remain from the Elemental Wars era are valuable not just as resources in the game, but as pieces of living history. Every dwarven gadget you find in the mines was created by someone, a dwarven engineer who had skills and knowledge and perhaps family. Every dwarven scroll was written by someone who had thoughts and ideas worth recording. These are not just items. They are remnants of people, of a culture that is now gone. Similarly, the few items associated with shadow people that can be found, void essences and dark talismans, are hints of their magical traditions, their spiritual practices, the ways they understood and interacted with reality. Collecting these items and donating them to the museum is, in a sense, an act of remembrance. You are preserving what little remains of these civilizations, ensuring that even if their people are gone, their legacy is not completely forgotten. Gunther, the museum curator, plays an interesting role in this. He never directly comments on the implications of the dwarven and shadow artifacts you donate, but his museum serves as a memorial, a place where the physical evidence of these ancient peoples is preserved and displayed. The museum becomes a neutral ground, a place where dwarven technology and shadow people artifacts can coexist peacefully in display cases, a symbolic contrast to the violent history they represent. In a world where Krobus and the dwarf can barely tolerate each other's existence, the museum shows what could be, a place where the accomplishments and culture of both civilizations are honored equally, without judgment or bias. The tragedy of the elemental wars is compounded by the fact that it may have been avoidable. If the dwarves, upon arriving on this world, had been more careful in their expansion, had they taken the time to determine whether the caverns they were mining were occupied, could the conflict have been prevented? If the Shadow People, upon first encountering dwarven miners, had tried communication rather than immediate retaliation, could understanding have been reached? We will never know. What we do know is that once the cycle of violence began, once the first deaths occurred and both sides started accumulating grievances, the path to peace became increasingly difficult. Each new act of violence justified the next. Each death demanded vengeance. Each atrocity was met with an answering atrocity, until after decades, after centuries, the original causes of the war became irrelevant. All that mattered was the hate, the pain, the loss. All that mattered was continuing to fight, because to stop fighting would mean admitting that the deaths of your people, your family, your friends had been for nothing. This is the insidious nature of prolonged conflict. The longer it goes on, the harder it becomes to stop, because stopping requires both sides to accept that much of what they have done was pointless, that the sacrifices they made did not actually achieve anything meaningful. The elemental wars could not produce a winner because both sides lost everything that mattered. The dwarves may have driven the Shadow People deep underground, but in doing so they destroyed their own civilization. The Shadow People may have killed countless dwarves, but in doing so they ensured their own near extinction. Both sides fought to survive, and in fighting they ensured that neither would truly survive. Only exist, only persist, broken, scattered, reduced to the barest remnants. The silence in the deepest minds is the silence of waste, of potential unfulfilled, of two civilizations that could have achieved great things, that could have learned from each other, that could have coexisted and perhaps even cooperated, instead choosing mutual destruction. The dwarves had technology that could have benefited the Shadow People. The Shadow People had magical knowledge that could have benefited the dwarves. Together, they might have created wonders. Instead, they created graves. And now, in the present day of Stardew Valley, we are left with the aftermath. A lone dwarf running a shop in a mine, surrounded by the ruins of their people's glory. A lone shadow person hiding in the sewers, afraid and isolated. The occasional shadow brute in the mines, mindless and hostile, a degraded echo of what the Shadow People once were. The automated defenses on Ginger Island, still following protocols set 1,000 years ago by dwarves who are long dead. The vast empty caverns deep underground, once bustling with life from both civilizations, now home only to monsters and silence. This is what the elemental wars accomplished. This is their legacy. Not victory, not glory, not the security of either people. Just loss, just waste, just an object lesson in the cost of unending conflict. But there is still Krobus, and there is still the dwarf, and there is still the seal of promise, and there is still the player showing both of them that another way is possible. The elemental wars are over. The civilizations that fought them are gone. But the survivors remain. And as long as survivors remain, as long as there is still breath in their bodies and will in their hearts, the possibility of a different future exists. The lessons of the elemental wars extend beyond Krobus and the dwarf. They speak to anyone who has experienced conflict, loss, and the weight of historical trauma. They remind us that peace is not the natural state that emerges after war. Peace is work. Peace requires conscious choice, requires setting aside justified anger, requires seeing the humanity or personhood in those who have harmed you and yours. The seal of promise is not a happy ending. It is a beginning, a fragile first step. The real work comes after. The daily choice to honor that peace even when old wounds ache, even when memories resurface, even when instinct screams for vengeance. In the broader context of Stardew Valley's themes, The elemental wars represent the darkest aspect of the valley's history. While the game primarily focuses on community building, personal growth, and the healing power of nature and simple living, the story of the dwarves and shadow people reminds us that darkness exists even in the most idyllic settings, that history leaves scars, that trauma is real and lasting, that some losses can never be recovered. The community center can be restored, relationships can be mended, the valley can flourish, but the dwarven cities will never be rebuilt. The shadow people civilization will never return to what it was. The dead will never come back. This is mature, honest storytelling. It acknowledges that not everything can be fixed, that some damage is permanent. But it also insists that despite this, despite the weight of history and the depth of loss, choosing peace over continued violence is still worthwhile, still necessary, still the only path forward that doesn't lead to absolute extinction. The elemental wars destroyed two civilizations, but they did not have to destroy the last survivors. Krobus and the dwarf choosing to honor the seal of promise, however reluctantly, is an act of courage. It is choosing life over death, future over past, possibility over certainty of destruction. The player's journey through the mines takes on deeper meaning when viewed through this lens. Every ore you mine, every gem you collect, every level you descend, you are walking through a graveyard. You are extracting resources from the ruins of civilizations that tore themselves apart. The monsters you fight are the descendants or creations of that war. The very ground beneath your feet has been soaked in blood, or whatever the shadow people have instead of blood. This history is not separate from your farming experience. It is woven into it. The minerals that help you upgrade your tools, the gems that you sell for profit, the coal that powers your furnaces, all of it comes from the underground, from the battlefield of the elemental wars. And yet life continues. Crops grow. Relationships form. The community center is restored. Children play. Seasons turn. The valley heals, not by forgetting its past, but by acknowledging it and choosing to build something better on top of it. The player, in befriending both Krobus and the dwarf, in facilitating their fragile peace, becomes part of this healing. You are not erasing the elemental wars. You cannot. But you are helping to ensure that they remain in the past, that they do not continue into the future, that the last two witnesses to that terrible conflict can live out their remaining days in peace rather than perpetuating the cycle that destroyed everything they knew. The underground world of Stardew Valley, with its layers of history and its silent testimony to ancient conflicts, stands as one of the most sophisticated pieces of world building in any farming simulator. It transforms what could have been a simple resource gathering mechanic into a meditation on war, peace, trauma, and reconciliation. It asks difficult questions. When both sides have legitimate grievances, who is right? When both sides have committed atrocities, who deserves peace? When the costs of continued conflict are absolute extinction, is choosing to stop fighting an act of wisdom or an admission of defeat? And most importantly, can healing ever truly occur? Or is the best we can hope for simply an agreement to stop inflicting new wounds? The dwarves and shadow people, through their representatives Krobus and the dwarf, embody these questions. They have no easy answers. The game does not tell you who was right or who was wrong. It simply shows you two survivors, both traumatized, both nursing justified anger, both choosing, with difficulty and with magical enforcement, to stop fighting. That is the reality of peace after prolonged conflict. It is messy. It is painful. It is not satisfying in any traditional sense. But it is necessary, because the alternative is the silence of the deep mines, the empty ruins, the complete absence of life. The alternative is extinction. And so the elemental wars end, not with triumph but with exhaustion. Not with reconciliation but with enforced ceasefire. Not with forgiveness but with agreement to coexist. It is not the ending that either civilization would have wanted, back when they were strong and proud and convinced of their rightness, but it is the only ending that leaves anyone alive to have an ending at all. In the darkness of the mines, among the ruins and the monsters and the remnants of glory, Krobus and the dwarf survive. And in surviving, in choosing to honor the seal of promise, in accepting the player's friendship, they keep alive the possibility that someday, perhaps, their people's stories will be more than just a cautionary tale about the cost of war. The deep places remember. The stone remembers. The darkness remembers. The elemental wars are finished, as the wizard says. But they are not forgotten. They cannot be forgotten. The very geography of the underground is their memorial. Every cavern, every tunnel, every vein of or is a page in the story of what happened when two civilizations, neither truly evil, neither truly good, met in the darkness and chose violence over understanding, until they had destroyed everything, and only then realized that perhaps there had been another way. This is the legacy of the elemental wars. This is the story written in stone and shadow beneath the peaceful surface of Stardew Valley. This is what the mines whisper to those who listen. A tale of pride and fear, of technology and magic, of ancient grievances and lasting trauma. A tale that ended not with a hero's triumph, but with two exhausted survivors agreeing, finally, to simply stop, to let it end, to let the dead rest and the living continue. It is not a happy tale, but it is an important one, and it is, in its way, a tale of hope. Because if Krobus and the dwarf can choose peace after 1,000 years of war, after personal loss and civilizational collapse, after every reason to continue fighting, then perhaps anyone can. Perhaps any conflict can end. Perhaps any cycle can be broken. Not easily, not cleanly, but possibly. And in a world that often feels dominated by unending conflicts and unresolvable hatreds, that possibility, however small, however fragile, however dependent on conscious choice and external intervention, is worth holding on to. The elemental wars are over. Long live the peace, uncertain though it may be. The physical evidence of the elemental wars extends far beyond the immediate vicinity of Pelican Town's mines. The volcanic regions discovered on Ginger Island present perhaps the most intact and revealing archaeological site of dwarven civilization at its height. When the player first ventures into the volcano dungeon, they encounter something extraordinary. Flying mechanical sentinels powered by gemstones patrol routes that were programmed centuries ago. Storage systems that utilize geothermal energy with such efficiency that modern Ferngill Republic engineers would struggle to reverse engineer them. And most impressively, the forge itself, a massive construction that still functions perfectly after 1,000 years or more, capable of enhancing weapons and tools to levels of power that seem almost magical in nature. The existence of such advanced installations on a distant island raises profound questions about the scope of dwarven civilization before the elemental wars. Ginger Island is not close to the valley. It requires significant sea travel to reach. Yet the dwarves built major industrial facilities there, suggesting that at their height, dwarven territory was not confined to a few cave systems beneath one valley. It spanned regions, perhaps continents. The dwarves had the technology, the population, and the organizational capacity to establish outposts across vast distances. They were not a small, isolated culture. They were an empire, a true civilization with the resources and ambition to match. The volcano dungeon's defensive systems provide insight into dwarven military capabilities during the war. The gem-powered automatons that still attack intruders are not crude war machines. They are sophisticated combat units capable of flight, equipped with ranged attacks, and programmed with complex tactical behaviors. They can adapt to threats, pursue targets through difficult terrain, and coordinate with other units. If these are merely defensive units, standard security for an industrial facility, then what must the dedicated war machines have been like? What weapons did the dwarves deploy in actual military operations against Shadow People strongholds? The implications are staggering. The elemental wars were not fought with primitive weapons and simple tactics. This was advanced technological warfare on a scale that would dwarf most conflicts in recorded human history. Yet, for all their technological superiority, the dwarves could not achieve victory. The Shadow People, with their very different set of capabilities, proved capable of matching dwarven might for 1,000 years. This speaks to the incredible power that the Shadow People possessed. They had no advanced technology, or at least none that has survived in recognizable form. They had no automated armies, no gem-powered forges, no facilities that still function centuries later. What they had was magic, and their magic was potent enough to stand against dwarven technology for a millennium. The Shadow Shamans, those hostile variants of Shadow People that players encounter in the deepest mines, demonstrate abilities that defy conventional understanding. They can teleport short distances, vanishing and reappearing at will. They can cast curses that weaken and disorient their targets. They project dark energy in devastating attacks. And these are the degraded, traumatized descendants of the Shadow People who fought in the war. The original Shadow Shamans, the ones who commanded the full magical traditions of their people, must have been terrifying opponents. Consider what it would take to fight against dwarven technology with magic. The dwarves could collapse tunnels with explosives, but Shadow People could phase through solid rock, rendering such tactics less effective. The dwarves could build fortifications of metal and stone, but shadow magic could corrupt those materials, causing them to weaken and fail. The dwarves could create automated defenders, but shadow curses could turn those machines against their creators or simply shut them down. Every technological advantage the dwarves developed, the Shadow People found a magical counter for. And likewise, every magical attack the Shadow People perfected, the dwarves found a technological defense against. It was an arms race conducted across centuries, with both sides innovating, adapting, escalating, neither willing to surrender, neither able to achieve decisive victory. The psychological toll of such a prolonged conflict cannot be overstated. Imagine being a young dwarf born into a world at war, knowing that your grandparents fought the Shadow People, and their grandparents before them, and their grandparents before them, stretching back through generations beyond memory. Imagine growing up learning that the Shadow People are the enemy, the threat, the reason your people live in constant fear. Imagine hearing stories of settlements destroyed, of families killed, of technological marvels lost to shadow attacks. How could you not hate them? How could you not see them as monsters deserving of extermination? And the same applies to the Shadow People. Imagine being a young shadow shaman, growing up in the deep darkness, learning from the elders about the dwarves who invaded your ancestral home, who killed your people, who pushed you ever deeper into the earth. Imagine being taught that dwarves are the enemy, that they will never stop until every shadow person is dead. How could you not fight back? How could you not see them as invaders deserving of destruction? This is how generational conflict works. The original reasons for the war become irrelevant. What matters is the accumulated trauma, the personal losses, the cultural identity built around the conflict. By the time several centuries had passed, there were dwarves and shadow people who knew nothing but war. Their entire civilization, their entire sense of self was defined by this conflict. Proposing peace would feel like betrayal, like dishonoring the sacrifices of all who had died. The war became self-perpetuating, fed by its own momentum, powered by grief and rage that had nowhere else to go. This is the true tragedy of the elemental wars. Not just the destruction and death, but the way the conflict trapped both peoples in cycles of violence that they could not escape even when they wanted to. The economic and social impact of a 1,000-year war would have been catastrophic for both civilizations. For the dwarves, the need to constantly produce weapons, maintain defenses, and replace losses would have consumed resources that could have been used for peaceful development. Dwarven engineers who might have created wonders, who might have pushed their technology to even greater heights, instead spent their lives designing better weapons and stronger fortifications. Dwarven miners who might have explored and settled new territories instead had to focus on defensive positions and strategic resource denial. The war didn't just kill dwarves. It killed dwarven potential, stunted their civilization's growth, prevented them from becoming what they might have been. For the shadow people, the effects were even more severe. They were already refugees, displaced from the void by some catastrophe. The physical plane was not their natural home. They were adapting, learning to exist in this new reality, building a society in the darkness. And then came the dwarves and war, and the need to fight for survival in a world that already felt alien and hostile. Whatever cultural and spiritual traditions the shadow people had brought with them from the void would have been disrupted, perhaps destroyed entirely, by the demands of constant conflict. Art, philosophy, peaceful magic, all the things that make a civilization rich and meaningful, would have been sacrificed to the necessities of war. The shadow people in the mines, the hostile brutes and shamans, are tragic figures. They are beings who have forgotten how to be anything other than warriors. Their culture has been reduced to violence because violence is all they have known for so long. The question of whether other survivors exist beyond Krobus and the handful of dwarves we meet is one that haunts the lore. Are there hidden enclaves of shadow people, deep in, unexplored caverns, maintaining some remnant of their old culture? Are there dwarven cities that survived, sealed off from the war zones, where populations still live though cut off from the outside world? Or are the beings we meet truly the last, the final remnants of civilizations that once numbered in the hundreds of thousands or millions? The game does not answer this. The silence on the matter is itself ominous. In a world where we encounter only one friendly shadow person and 2 or 3 dwarves across the entire valley and Ginger Island, it suggests that both populations have been reduced to near extinction. If there were large surviving populations, surely we would encounter more evidence of them. The ecological and geological changes wrought by the elemental wars have permanently altered the subterranean environment. The presence of slimes, bats, rock crabs, and other creatures throughout the mines is not natural. These are species that have adapted to an environment shaped by warfare, by magical contamination, by technological runoff. The slimes in particular, with their various colors and elemental affinities, suggest mutation driven by exposure to energies that should not exist in nature. Purple slimes that seem connected to shadow magic. Red slimes found near lava and volcanic activity where dwarven industry was concentrated. The tiger slimes on Ginger Island, near the volcano dungeon with its active dwarven technology. These creatures are the unintended consequences of war, species that evolved or mutated to survive in an environment poisoned by conflict. The deeper levels of the mines and the skull cavern present environmental hazards that are difficult to explain through natural geology alone. Areas where the temperature fluctuates wildly. Sections where magnetic fields seem distorted, affecting equipment. Caverns where sounds echo in ways that defy acoustic principles. These anomalies are likely the result of reality itself being stressed by the massive energies unleashed during the war. When shadow magic and dwarven technology clashed at their most powerful, they may have created permanent distortions in the fabric of space and time, weak points where the normal rules of physics don't quite apply. Walking through these areas, players are experiencing the literal scars that war left on reality. The mine carts and rail systems found throughout the mines deserve particular attention. These are clearly dwarven constructions, infrastructure built to transport ore and personnel between different levels and regions. The fact that a rail system connects the mines, the quarry, and extends all the way to the desert suggests that at one time, there was a functioning dwarven transportation network spanning the entire region. This was not a primitive civilization scratching out survival in caves. This was an industrial power with logistics, with planned infrastructure, with the engineering capacity to build and maintain complex systems across difficult terrain. The rails are old, damaged, no longer fully functional without repair. But they remain, a testament to dwarven ambition and capability, and also a reminder that all that capability, all that infrastructure could not prevent their near destruction. The monsters encountered in the mines can be categorized in ways that reveal patterns related to the war. The shadow brutes and shadow shamans are obviously shadow people who have become hostile and feral. But what about the other creatures? The stone golems and metal heads that appear in deeper levels might be dwarven creations, security systems, or mining assistants that have gone rogue after centuries without maintenance. Their aggressive behavior toward intruders would have been programmed during the war, when any unknown entity had to be treated as a potential threat. The fact that they attack the player suggests their combat subroutines are still active, still following orders given centuries ago by dwarven military planners who are long dead. It's a chilling thought. You're not just being attacked by mindless monsters. You're being attacked by soldiers still fighting a war that ended before you were born. The bats, serpents, and other organic creatures present a different question. Were they native to the caves and corrupted by war energies? Or were they deliberately created, either as weapons or as unintended byproducts of magical experiments? Shadow people might have used dark magic to create or summon creatures to fight on their behalf, biological weapons to counter dwarven technology. Some of these creations might have escaped control, breeding and multiplying in the abandoned war zones. The bats with their aggressive behavior and surprising strength for their size. The serpents in Skull Cavern with their speed and venom. These do not feel like natural species. They feel engineered, designed, purposeful in ways that suggest intelligent creation. The iridium found in the deepest levels of Skull Cavern and sometimes in the regular mines raises interesting questions about resource competition during the war. Iridium is the most valuable ore in the game, capable of producing equipment of exceptional quality. If iridium was known to the dwarves and shadow people, it would have been a strategic resource of the highest importance. Control of iridium deposits might have been a major objective of military campaigns. Battles fought over access to iridium veins could explain why the deepest and most dangerous areas of the mines and Skull Cavern are so heavily infested with monsters and environmental hazards. These were the most contested territories, the places where both sides committed their best forces and most powerful weapons. The concentration of dangerous creatures and valuable resources in the same locations is not coincidental. The creatures are there because the resources are there, because those areas were militarily significant during the war. Krobus's shop inventory offers subtle clues about shadow people culture and capabilities. He sells void eggs which hatch into void chickens. This suggests that shadow people had some form of animal husbandry, the ability to breed and maintain creatures suited to darkness. The void chickens are not naturally occurring. They are too specifically adapted to subterranean life, too comfortable with shadow magic. They must be the product of selective breeding or magical alteration by shadow people over many generations. This implies that shadow people civilization had periods of stability, peace, and development. You cannot develop animal husbandry in the middle of constant warfare. There must have been times, whether before the war or in lulls during the conflict, when shadow people lived settled lives, farming in their own way, developing their culture. Krobus also sells omni-geodes and various gems and minerals. How does he acquire these? He does not mine them himself, or at least he never mentions doing so. It's possible he trades with other shadow people, survivors who remain deeper in the caves and occasionally bring supplies to him. Or perhaps he has access to old shadow people stockpiles, resources cached during the war and never reclaimed. Either possibility suggests that the shadow people infrastructure, whatever form it took, had some level of sophistication. They were not just warriors. They had economy, trade, storage, logistics. They had a functioning society, and remnants of that society might still exist in forms we never directly see. The Dwarf shop offers similar insights. They sell bombs and explosive ammo, obviously tools developed for mining but also clearly useful in warfare. The cherry bombs, mega bombs, and other explosives would have been devastating weapons against shadow people positions. The Dwarf also sells processed foods, indicating knowledge of food preservation and possibly agriculture or food synthesis technology. Dwarves had to eat. With large populations living entirely underground, they would have needed efficient food production methods. Did they have underground farms lit by artificial light? Did they process minerals into edible substances through technology we cannot comprehend? The Dwarf never explains, but their ability to sell cooked and preserved food suggests answers to these questions exist. The star drop that Krobus sells is one of the most mysterious items in the game. Eating it permanently increases the player's maximum energy, and the flavor text describes it as a perfect fruit that fills you with energy. Where did Krobus get a star drop? They are incredibly rare, with only a handful available in the entire game through various means. The fact that Krobus possesses one and is willing to sell it suggests that star drops might be connected to shadow people somehow. Perhaps they are not natural fruits but magical constructs, created by shadow shamans in ages past. Or perhaps they grow naturally in the deepest darkness, in places where reality is thin and magic pools like water. Either way, the star drop represents something beyond mere physical sustenance. It is transformation, permanent enhancement, a touch of something transcendent. That shadow people had access to such things implies their magical traditions were deeper and more sophisticated than the hostile shamans in the mines would suggest. The question of reproduction and population dynamics for both species during the war is significant. A 1,000-year conflict requires population replacement. You cannot sustain warfare for that long if your species cannot reproduce faster than it is being killed. For the dwarves, this suggests they had substantial populations during most of the war, enough that losses could be absorbed and replaced. But somewhere toward the end, that changed. Either casualties became so severe that reproduction could not keep up, or something else happened, perhaps disease or resource depletion, that caused population collapse. The shadow people faced similar challenges. Their numbers must have been significant during the height of the war, but by the end, they too had been reduced to near extinction. Did both sides reach critical population thresholds around the same time? Is that why the war ended? Because both species simultaneously realized they were on the brink of extinction. The role of other species and civilizations during the elemental wars is unclear but potentially significant. Were humans present in the valley during the conflict? If so, did they know about the war raging beneath their feet? Did they take sides or remain neutral? The wizard speaks about the elemental wars as historical fact, suggesting that knowledge of the conflict exists in human magical circles. But the common people of Pelican Town seem unaware of the true history of the mines and the civilizations that fought there. This knowledge gap might be deliberate. Perhaps early human leaders decided it was better for people not to know about the ancient wars, the powerful beings living underground, the potential for conflict to resurface. Ignorance as protection, or at least as comfort. The Junimos present another interesting angle. These forest spirits clearly have their own magic and their own agendas. Did they know about the elemental wars? The community center that they inhabit and seek to restore is on the surface, far from the underground battlegrounds. But the Junimos are ancient and magical. They might have been aware of the conflict, might even have opinions about it. Their emphasis on community, cooperation, and natural harmony stands in stark contrast to the centuries of violence between dwarves and shadow people. Perhaps the Junimos represent what the valley could be, should be, a place where different beings coexist peacefully. And the elemental wars represent the failure to achieve that ideal. The wizard's knowledge and his intervention in the conflict between Krobus and the dwarf raises questions about his own history. He is human, but he possesses magical knowledge far beyond normal human capabilities. How old is he? Has he been alive for centuries, watching the valley's history unfold? Or has he inherited knowledge from previous generations of wizards, passed down through a magical tradition? His tower in the Cindersap Forest is isolated, deliberately separate from town. He is protecting something or protecting the town from something. Could he have been involved in monitoring the elemental wars, ensuring that they did not spill over into the human world? His immediate response to the confrontation in the sewers, his ready knowledge of what is happening and how to stop it, suggests preparation. He has been waiting for this possibility, ready to intervene if necessary. The seal of promise that the wizard casts is itself a fascinating piece of magic. It binds Krobus and the dwarf to a mutual agreement not to harm each other, enforcing peace through magical compulsion. This is not simple magic. This is sophisticated, powerful spellwork that operates on concepts of agreement, promise, and binding. It requires consent from both parties, but once given, that consent becomes magically enforced. What other uses might such magic have? Could it have been used during the elemental wars to broker temporary truces or local peace agreements? If so, why wasn't it used to end the war entirely? The most likely answer is that you need both parties to genuinely agree, to be bound. During the height of the war, neither side would have agreed to such terms. Only now, with both civilizations reduced to remnants, exhausted and traumatized, does the possibility of agreement exist. The broader implications of the elemental wars for the Stardew Valley world are profound. This was a conflict that involved advanced technology, powerful magic, and reshaping of geography. Yet it occurred largely out of sight of surface civilization, unknown to most humans. What does that say about the world? How many other ancient conflicts, other hidden peoples, other forgotten wars might have occurred? The valley is full of mysteries. The existence of the dwarves and shadow people, their thousand-year war, is just one of many secrets buried in its soil and stone. The sewers where Krobus lives contain mutant bugs and slimes, creatures that definitely should not exist. What created them? The abandoned Joja warehouse hints at corporate secrets and possibly illegal experiments. The witch who was once married to the wizard represents another magical tradition, potentially hostile. The world of Stardew Valley is not safe or simple. It is layered with dangers, with history, with forces that most people never suspect exist. For players engaged with the game's deeper lore, this creates a sense of discovery and wonder. You came to the valley to farm, to escape corporate life, to find peace. But you have stumbled into something much larger. You have become entangled in ancient histories, in conflicts between non-human civilizations, in magical traditions that predate human settlement. And more than that, you have become an agent of healing. By befriending Krobus and the dwarf, by helping them move past their enmity, you are accomplishing something that centuries of warfare could not. You are proving that peace is possible, that individuals can transcend their cultural programming, that kindness can bridge even the widest divides. This theme resonates with the game's overall message. Stardew Valley is ultimately about community, about connecting with others, about choosing cooperation over competition. The corporate path represented by Joja Mart is efficient but soulless, transactional but empty. The community path represented by restoring the community center through Junimo bundles is difficult but meaningful, requiring effort but creating genuine bonds. The choice between Krobus and the dwarf continuing their war or choosing peace mirrors the choice between Joja and community. The easy path is to hold on to hate, to see the other as enemy, to refuse connection. The difficult path is to set aside justified anger, to see the individual beyond the stereotype, to choose relationship despite pain. Krobus, if you befriend him enough, can become your roommate. This is an extraordinary development. A shadow person, a being whose people fought a 1,000-year war with the dwarves, a being who feared assassination and lived in hiding, choosing to live openly with a human on their farm. It represents trust on a profound level. Krobus is literally placing his life in your hands. If you betrayed him, if you revealed his presence to those who might harm him, he would have no defense. His willingness to take that risk, to believe in your friendship enough to leave his refuge in the sewers, is a powerful statement about the possibility of change and growth even after severe trauma. The dwarf, though not offering roommate status, likewise shows development through friendship. Their early dialogue is suspicious, wary, seeing humans as potential threats or at best curiosities. But as your friendship grows, they open up, sharing memories and pain, discussing their lost civilization and their grief. They begin to see you not as a member of a potentially hostile species, but as an individual worthy of trust. This is the work of healing, The slow process of learning to connect again after trauma has taught you that connection is dangerous. The mines themselves can be seen as a character in the story of the elemental wars. They are not passive backdrop. They are active presence, a living monument to everything that was lost. Every level you descend is another chapter in the story. The upper levels, relatively safe with weaker monsters and basic ores, represent the early stages of both civilizations, when they were still establishing themselves, when conflict was beginning but had not yet consumed everything. The middle levels, more dangerous with stronger monsters and better resources, represent the height of the war, when both sides committed fully, when the fighting was most intense. The deepest levels, with the most dangerous creatures and the rarest resources, represent the final stages, the desperate last efforts, the places where reality itself began to break under the strain of so much violence. And Skull Cavern, that seemingly endless descent into darkness, represents something beyond the war itself. It is the abyss, the void, the final destination of a conflict that had no end. The cavern has no bottom that players have found. It just goes deeper and deeper, becoming more dangerous with every level, offering greater rewards but demanding greater risk. This is the logical endpoint of the elemental wars. If they had continued, if exhaustion had not finally forced both sides to stop, the conflict would have descended further and further into darkness, consuming everything, until nothing remained but the endless void. The fact that players can survive in Skull Cavern, can delve deep and return with treasures, can face its dangers and overcome them, is itself meaningful. You are proving that the darkness does not have to be eternal, that you can enter the deepest places, the most dangerous remnants of ancient conflicts, and emerge alive. You can face the legacy of the elemental wars and not be destroyed by it. This gives hope that Krobus and the Dwarf, survivors of that conflict, can likewise survive its aftermath, can build new lives despite their trauma, can find meaning beyond violence. The story of the dwarves and shadow people, the elemental wars, and their aftermath is perhaps the darkest and most complex narrative in Stardew Valley. It stands in contrast to the game's generally optimistic tone, but it also enhances that optimism. Because if healing is possible even here, even after 1,000 years of war and civilizational collapse, then healing is possible anywhere. If Krobus and the Dwarf can honor the seal of promise and choose peace, then no conflict is truly irresolvable. The darkness of their history makes the light of their potential future all the more precious. In the end, the elemental wars teach us that violence, even when seemingly justified, even when driven by legitimate grievances and survival instincts, ultimately serves no one. Both sides lost everything. Both sides are now reduced to a handful of survivors clinging to existence in a world that has moved on without them. The war accomplished nothing except destruction. And yet, despite that failure, despite the complete waste of 1,000 years and countless lives, hope persists. Because as long as individuals like Krobus and the Dwarf exist, as long as beings capable of choice and growth survive, the possibility of a better future remains. The wars may have destroyed civilizations, but they did not destroy the capacity for change, for growth, for peace. The mines stand silent now, their depths haunted by memories and monsters, but no longer by active warfare. The shadow people and dwarves who fought there are gone. Their cities abandoned, their technologies failing, their cultures fading into legend. But the land remembers, the stone remembers, and we who walk through those ancient battlefields, collecting or in fighting monsters, we carry that memory forward. We ensure that the sacrifices, the losses, the terrible lessons of the elemental wars are not forgotten entirely. We preserve the story, incomplete though our understanding may be. And in preserving it, we honor both the victims and the survivors, and we commit ourselves to ensuring that such devastating conflict need never happen again. This is the legacy of the elemental wars. Not glory, not victory, but a hard-won, fragile, precious peace, purchased at the price of everything two civilizations once possessed, and maintained only through continued choice and effort. The darkness still exists in the deep places. The dangers still lurk in forgotten caverns. The scars of ancient warfare still mark the land. But above ground, in the valley, life continues. Crops grow, friendships form, communities thrive, and deep below, in the sewers and in the mines, two survivors of an ancient war choose, each day, to honor their promise and live in peace. It is not a perfect ending, but it is an ending that allows for futures, for possibilities, for hope. And sometimes, after 1,000 years of darkness, that is enough. The deeper philosophical questions raised by the elemental wars extend into territory that makes many uncomfortable. The question of justice, for instance. What does justice look like after a 1,000-year war where both sides committed atrocities? Krobus is peaceful now, but his people killed dwarves. The dwarf is a merchant now, but their people killed shadow people. Do they bear responsibility for what their civilizations did? Can individuals be held accountable for collective actions? Or does the sheer scale and duration of the conflict make concepts like guilt and innocence meaningless? In traditional narratives, we expect clear moral resolution. The heroes defeat the villains, justice is served, wrongs are righted. But the elemental wars offer no such satisfaction. There is no villain to defeat because both sides were simultaneously victim and aggressor. There is no justice to be served because the crimes were so vast and so mutual that any attempt at accountability would simply restart the cycle of violence. The only resolution possible is the one we see, an enforced truce between traumatized survivors who agree to stop fighting not because they have forgiven each other, but because continuing would mean mutual extinction. This is uncomfortable, feels incomplete, but it is also honest in a way that fantasy rarely manages. The economic dimensions of the post-war reality deserve examination. Both Krobus and the dwarf now function as merchants, selling goods to the player. This is significant. They have transitioned from warfare to commerce, from conflict to trade. Instead of fighting over resources, they are now exchanging them peacefully with a third party, the human farmer. This represents adaptation, a finding of new purpose in a world where their old purpose, the prosecution of the war, no longer exists. Trade requires trust. It requires predictability and mutual benefit. The fact that both Krobus and the dwarf are capable of engaging in commerce, of honoring transactions, of building economic relationships, suggests that they retain the capacity for civilized behavior despite their trauma. Their choice of goods is revealing. Krobus sells items connected to darkness and the void eggs, strange buns, omni-geodes. These are items that reflect shadow people nature and heritage. He is sharing aspects of his culture through commerce, allowing humans to access things that would otherwise be impossible to obtain. The dwarf sells mining supplies and processed goods, bombs and cherry bombs, coal and ore. These are practical items connected to dwarven expertise in mining and engineering. Even in their reduced state, they still possess knowledge and capabilities that humans lack. The commercial relationship is not charity. It is mutual benefit. The player wants their goods, and they want the player's money or other resources. This is the foundation of peaceful coexistence, finding ways to benefit from each other's existence rather than threatening it. The question of language and communication in the elemental wars is fascinating. The dwarf speaks Dwarvish, a language unintelligible to humans until the player finds the Dwarvish translation guide, one of the 4 dwarf scrolls scattered through the mines. This suggests that during the height of dwarven civilization, there was enough contact between dwarves and humans that humans felt it necessary to create translation guides. Or perhaps the scrolls were created by dwarves themselves as outreach to the human world. Either way, the existence of these translation tools implies that at some point, someone thought communication between species was important enough to facilitate. Did the shadow people and dwarves ever successfully communicate with each other during their 1,000-year conflict? Or was the entire war fought without real communication, each side operating on assumptions and prejudices about the other. Krobus speaks what seems to be the common human language, suggesting that shadow people are capable of learning other languages. If they could learn to speak to humans, could they have learned to speak to dwarves? The failure of communication, if that is what happened, would be a tragedy, compounding the physical tragedy of the war. How many misunderstandings might have been cleared up through dialogue? How many escalations might have been prevented by negotiation? But perhaps communication was attempted and failed. Perhaps representatives from both sides met and tried to find common ground, only to discover that their differences were too fundamental to bridge. The dwarves needed to mine, to expand, to extract resources for their technology and survival. The shadow people needed to preserve their territory, to maintain the sanctity of their ancestral homeland, to protect the places where their people had found refuge after fleeing the void. These needs may have been genuinely incompatible. Sometimes conflicts arise not from misunderstanding but from understanding all too well that what one side needs directly threatens what the other side needs. In such cases, communication clarifies the problem but cannot solve it. The magical aspects of the shadow people culture remain largely mysterious. We see shadow shamans using offensive magic in the mines, but what about the peaceful applications of their magical traditions? Krobus sells void eggs, which require magic to create or maintain. What other magical knowledge did the shadow people possess? Could they have used their connection to the void for beneficial purposes, transportation, communication across vast distances, manipulation of space and time? The catastrophe that forced them from the void suggests they were at least advanced enough to trigger or survive a dimensional collapse. That level of magical sophistication implies capabilities far beyond what we see in the degraded remnants of their civilization. Consider what might have been if peace had been established early, if the dwarves and shadow people had become allies rather than enemies. Dwarven technology combined with shadow people magic could have achieved wonders. Imagine mining operations that used shadow magic to phase through rock without damaging it, extracting or with perfect precision. Imagine dwarven devices powered not by geothermal energy or gems, but by void energy channeled by shadow shamans. Imagine transportation networks that combined dwarven engineering with shadow portals, allowing instantaneous travel between distant locations. The potential for synergy was enormous. Instead, both civilizations spent 1,000 years destroying that potential, ensuring that the wonders they might have created together would never exist. The environmental cost of the elemental wars extends beyond the immediate battlefields. The disruption to underground water systems, the collapse of major caverns, the creation of new fault lines from deliberate earthquakes and tunnel collapses, all of this would have had surface-level consequences. Did rivers change course because underground aquifers were breached? Did valleys flood or dry up? Did earthquakes caused by underground warfare shake surface settlements? The people of Pelican Town and other surface communities might have experienced effects of the war without understanding the cause. Natural disasters that were actually unnatural, caused by the conflict raging beneath their feet. The mines as they exist now are a hazardous environment for humans. Monsters, cave-ins, toxic gases, all present dangers to anyone who ventures deep. Yet during the height of dwarven civilization, these same caverns would have been safe, well-lit, maintained tunnels with proper support structures and air circulation. The current state represents catastrophic infrastructure decay. Systems that once kept miners safe have failed. Automated defenses that once protected against specific threats now attack anything that moves. The mines have become dangerous not because they were always that way, but because they have been abandoned, left to decay for centuries after the civilization that built them was destroyed. Every danger the player faces in the mines is, in a sense, an echo of the war, a consequence of the destruction of the civilization that once maintained these spaces. The psychological landscape of the post-war world is complex. Krobus displays signs of trauma in his dialogue. He is fearful, anxious about discovery, worried about assassins. His choice to live in the sewers rather than in more comfortable locations speaks to his need to remain hidden, to feel safe in a world that has proven itself dangerous. When he agrees to be your roommate, it represents enormous trust and enormous risk. He is choosing to be visible, to be vulnerable, to live openly despite his fear. This is healing in action, the gradual process of learning to trust again after trauma has taught distrust as a survival mechanism. The dwarf shows different trauma symptoms. They are socially awkward with humans, uncertain how to navigate relationships with a species they don't fully understand. Their shop in the mines is a safe space, a controlled environment where they can interact on their terms. Their reluctance to speak about personal history, their focus on commerce rather than emotional connection, suggests someone who has learned to protect themselves through emotional distance. Only through patient friendship does the player break through that protective shell to reach the hurt individual beneath. The dwarf's grief over lost family is not abstract historical tragedy. It is personal pain that they carry every day. The concept of inherited trauma is relevant here. If any young dwarves or shadow people were born near the end of the war or shortly after its conclusion, they would have grown up in civilizations defined by trauma. Their parents and elders would have been damaged by war, unable to provide the stability and security that children need. The stories they would have heard, the attitudes they would have absorbed, would all be colored by conflict and loss. Breaking free from inherited trauma is extraordinarily difficult. It requires recognizing that the fear and anger that feels natural and justified is actually a learned response to circumstances that no longer exist. It requires choosing to relate differently to the world than your parents did. Krobus and the dwarf, if they have children or if their species recover enough to have future generations, face the challenge of not passing their trauma forward. This is part of why the Seal of Promise matters. It gives them a chance to model peace for whatever comes next, to show that different outcomes are possible. The wizard's role extends beyond just enforcing the truce between Krobus and the dwarf. He represents the perspective of a third party, someone not invested in the conflict who can see its futility more clearly than those directly involved. His statement that the elemental wars have long been finished is important because it establishes a temporal boundary. The wars are not ongoing. They are past. Treating them as present, continuing to act as if the war is still being fought, is a choice that Krobus and the dwarf make rather than an objective reality they must accept. The wizard's intervention is essentially telling them to acknowledge that time has passed. Circumstances have changed, and continuing to fight makes no sense given current reality. But change is hard, especially when identity has been built around conflict. If you have spent your entire life, or your entire civilization's existence, defining yourself in opposition to an enemy, who are you when that enmity ends? This is a real challenge for both dwarves and shadow people. Their civilizations were shaped by war for so long that peacetime identity might feel impossible to imagine. Krobus hiding in the sewers and the dwarf running a shop in the mines are both trying to figure out who they can be now that they are not warriors. The player helps them with this by treating them as individuals, as merchants, as potential friends, rather than as representatives of ancient conflicts. You model a different way of relating, and gradually they learn to adopt it. The artifacts that remain from both civilizations are finite resources slowly being consumed. Every dwarven gadget or scroll that the player finds and donates to the museum or sells or uses is one less piece of dwarven culture that exists in the world. The same applies to shadow people artifacts, though these are rarer. At some point, all the accessible artifacts will be recovered, and that will be it. No more physical evidence of these civilizations will be easily available. This makes preservation efforts, like Gunther's museum, vitally important. Without deliberate preservation, the dwarves and shadow people will be forgotten entirely within a few generations. Already most humans in Pelican Town are unaware of their existence. Once Krobus and the dwarf die, if there are no other survivors, the only traces of their peoples will be the items in the museum and the ruins in the deep places that few people ever visit. This is how civilizations end, not with dramatic final battles, but with slow fading into obscurity until they are no more than curiosities in museum displays. The theme of memory and forgetting runs through the entire narrative of the Elemental Wars. The dwarves have forgotten much of their own technological knowledge. The Shadow People have largely forgotten the void and whatever culture they had before the catastrophe. Both have partially forgotten the specific causes of their war, remembering only that the other side wronged them. Forgetting is presented as both loss and necessity. Forgetting specific grievances might be necessary for peace. If Krobus and the dwarf remembered every detail of every atrocity committed by the other side, maintaining even the fragile peace they have would be impossible. But forgetting also means losing their cultural heritage, their history, their understanding of who they were and where they came from. The player, by collecting artifacts and learning the lore, acts as an external memory, preserving what the civilizations themselves can no longer maintain. The integration of the Elemental Wars lore into the broader Stardew Valley narrative demonstrates sophisticated game design. These are not mandatory elements. A player can complete the game, enjoy the farming and relationships, defeat Jojamart, and never learn about the dwarves and Shadow People's history. But for players who want to engage deeper, who pay attention to details and seek out hidden content, the Elemental Wars provide a rich vein of dark, meaningful storytelling that adds weight to every trip into the mines. The game respects player choice about how much depth they want to experience. Casual players get a fun farming sim. Engaged players get complex narratives about war, trauma, and the possibility of healing. Both experiences are valid and both are supported by the game design. The contrast between the cheerful surface world of Pelican Town and the dark history of the underground creates thematic tension that enriches both elements. The town feels more precious, more worth protecting, when you know about the conflicts that could destroy it. The underground feels more tragic, more haunted, when you understand what was lost there. Neither space exists in isolation. They inform and reflect each other. The peace of the valley is built on foundations of ancient conflict. The possibility of future peace in the underground is inspired by the example of the surface community. The player serves as a connection between these worlds, bringing friendship and resources from the surface to the underground, and bringing knowledge and artifacts from the underground to the surface. The economic impact of reopening the mines is significant for Pelican Town. Clint benefits from increased demand for tool upgrades and/or processing. The Adventurers Guild gains purpose from providing monster fighting services and equipment. Your ability to extract valuable gems and minerals from the mines contributes to the local economy when you sell them. But from another perspective, you are looting the ruins of fallen civilizations for profit. Every piece of copper and gold and iridium you extract was mined or used by dwarves. Every monster you kill might be a degraded shadow person or a creation of shadow magic. Your actions as the player exist in morally complex space. You're helping the surface economy while disturbing the underground ruins. You're fighting monsters that might be sentient beings driven to hostility by trauma and territorial instinct. The game doesn't lecture you about this, but the information is there for players who want to think about these implications. The potential for future storylines involving the Elemental Wars and its survivors is enormous. What if other dwarves or shadow people are discovered? What if archaeological expeditions into the deepest caverns find intact cities, preserved by luck or magic, where populations still live? How would contact with these groups affect Krobus and the dwarf? Would they be overjoyed to find their people survived? Or would they be ostracized for having made peace with the enemy? Would the discovery of surviving populations restart the war, or could the example of Krobus and the dwarf's fragile peace serve as a model for broader reconciliation? These questions remain unanswered, leaving space for imagination and for potential future content. The Mines and Skull Cavern serve as memorials, but they are active memorials, spaces where the past continues to affect the present. Unlike a monument or a museum display that stands still and static, the underground is dangerous, challenging, demanding. It forces you to reckon with the consequences of the elemental wars in an immediate, visceral way. You cannot simply observe the history. You must survive it, fight through it, literally descend into its depths. This makes the learning of this lore feel earned rather than given. You extract the knowledge along with the ore and gems, piece by piece, level by level, descent by descent into the darkness. The symbolic resonance of the underground as a psychological space is worth considering. Descending into caves is often symbolic of confronting hidden truths, facing fears, exploring the subconscious. The player's journey into the mines mirrors this archetypal pattern. You descend into darkness to find valuable resources, yes, but also to find truth. The truth about the valley's history. The truth about the civilizations that came before. The truth about the costs of conflict and the value of peace. When you return to the surface, you bring both material wealth and wisdom. You are changed by what you have seen and learned. This is the classic hero's journey pattern, and the Elemental Wars lore fits perfectly into that framework. The final, untold chapters of the Elemental Wars remain mysterious. How exactly did it end? Was there a final battle? A plague that struck both sides? A natural disaster that forced a truce? The wizard says the wars have long been finished, but finished doesn't tell us how. Did leaders from both sides meet and negotiate an end? Or did the war simply peter out as populations declined to unsustainable levels? The lack of clear answer is narratively appropriate. After 1,000 years of conflict, endings are rarely clear or decisive. They tend to be messy, gradual, anticlimactic. The war probably didn't end with a bang, but with a whimper. Both sides too exhausted to continue, too damaged to rebuild, simply withdrawing to whatever refuges remained and trying to survive. Not victorious, not defeated, just finished. The legacy you, the player, leave in relation to the Elemental Wars depends entirely on your choices. You can ignore Krobus and the Dwarf entirely, treating them as mere merchants and never developing relationships. In that case, you are a neutral party, someone who uses the resources of the war but does not engage with its survivors. Or you can befriend both, triggering the confrontation and the wizard's intervention, actively participating in the healing process. You can choose to have Krobus as your roommate, making the most dramatic statement possible that shadow people deserve acceptance and integration into surface life. These choices matter narratively even if they don't dramatically affect gameplay mechanics. They represent your moral stance, your willingness to engage with difficult history, your commitment to peace and reconciliation over convenience and profit. The story of the Elemental Wars, when fully assembled from all its scattered pieces, stands as one of the most sophisticated and mature narratives in any farming simulation game. It tackles themes of historical trauma, the futility of endless war, the challenge of peace, the loss of civilizations, and the possibility of healing with nuance and depth. It doesn't offer easy answers or comfortable resolutions. It presents broken people from destroyed civilizations trying to figure out how to live in a world that has moved past their conflicts while they remain stuck in the trauma those conflicts created. And it suggests tentatively, hopefully, that maybe, just maybe, with help and effort and time, even the deepest wounds can begin to heal. Not fully, not perfectly, but enough to allow life to continue. Enough to allow new possibilities to emerge from the ruins of the old. Enough to allow two ancient enemies to agree, however reluctantly, to simply stop fighting and see what happens next. In a world full of conflict, that message resonates far beyond the pixelated minds of Stardew Valley. It speaks to something universal, something deeply human, about our capacity for both terrible violence and remarkable healing. And that is why the story of the dwarves and shadow people, hidden though it is beneath layers of gameplay and optional content, remains one of the most powerful and important stories the game has to tell. The theoretical possibility of reconciliation between the dwarven and shadow people. Civilizations, should larger populations exist, raises profound questions about collective versus individual healing. Krobus and the dwarf have achieved a fragile personal peace, enforced by the wizard's magic and facilitated by their individual exhaustion and isolation. But if communities of both peoples were to be discovered, intact and functional, would this personal peace translate to the broader populations? History suggests it would not. Individual relationships can transcend group conflicts, but scaling that transcendence to entire societies is exponentially more difficult. Consider the dynamics that would emerge if a hidden dwarven city were discovered deep beneath the valley, populated by thousands of dwarves who have maintained their culture and technology in isolation. These dwarves would not have experienced the total collapse that the lone dwarf in the mines has witnessed. They would not have the perspective that comes from being the last survivor. They might still have functioning military forces, operational weapons, and most dangerously, they might still have hope that the war could be won. The same applies to any surviving Shadow People communities. If they exist in numbers sufficient to maintain social structures, they would retain the organizational capacity for renewed conflict. The horror scenario is that the fragile peace established between Krobus and the dwarf could be shattered by the rediscovery of their peoples, dragging these two individuals who have moved beyond war back into its machinery. But there is an alternative possibility, one more hopeful. Perhaps Krobus and the dwarf, having achieved their difficult peace, could serve as ambassadors. They could bring the message that the war is over, that continuing is futile, that coexistence is possible. They are living proof that ancient enmities can be set aside. Their example might carry weight precisely because they are survivors of the war itself, not naive outsiders proposing peace from positions of comfort and ignorance. They know what the conflict cost. They carry the scars, and they have chosen to stop fighting. That choice, that testimony, might resonate with war-weary populations who have not yet reached the breaking point but are approaching it. The role of storytelling in either perpetuating or ending conflicts is relevant here. Both Dwarven and Shadow People cultures presumably have oral traditions, stories passed down through generations. What stories do they tell about each other? Are Shadow People children raised on tales of the evil dwarves who invaded their homeland and murdered their ancestors? Are young dwarves taught that Shadow People are monsters who destroyed dwarven cities and killed dwarven families? These narratives, however historically grounded they might be, serve to perpetuate enmity. Breaking cycles of violence requires changing narratives. It requires telling different stories. Krobus and the dwarf, by living peaceful lives and interacting positively with humans and eventually respecting the seal of promise with each other, are creating new stories. These are stories of survival not through violence but through adaptation. Stories of finding purpose beyond war. Stories that acknowledge pain without letting it define the future. The valley itself can be seen as a character in the story of the elemental wars, a place where healing from historical trauma is possible. The surface world of Stardew Valley is characterized by community, cooperation, natural cycles of growth and renewal. The community center restoration, the seasonal festivals, the web of relationships between villagers, all of these represent a functioning, healthy society. This stands in stark contrast to the devastated underground where two civilizations destroyed each other. The juxtaposition is deliberate. The valley offers a model, an example of what is possible when beings choose connection over conflict. Krobus, by agreeing to be the player's roommate, literally moves from the underground world of war remnants to the surface world of community and growth. This physical movement represents psychological and social movement as well. He is leaving behind the world that the elemental wars created and joining a different world, one where different rules and possibilities exist. The dwarf's position is more ambiguous. They remain in the mines, surrounded by the ruins of their civilization. They have not made the transition to the surface that Krobus has. This could represent several things. Perhaps the dwarf is not ready to leave behind the physical remnants of their culture, even if that culture is dead. Perhaps they feel a duty to maintain presence in the ancestral dwarven territories, to be a witness, to ensure that their people are not completely forgotten. Or perhaps the dwarf, unlike Krobus, still hopes for restoration. Maybe they believe that staying in the mines, maintaining the shop, keeping some form of dwarven presence active, will somehow preserve the possibility that their civilization can be rebuilt. This is both touching and tragic. The determination to maintain continuity in the face of overwhelming loss is admirable, but it also might represent an inability to fully accept what has been lost and move forward. The economic relationship between the player and these survivors takes on new dimensions when viewed through the lens of post-war reconstruction. You are their primary, perhaps only, customer. Your purchases keep them in business, give them purpose, provide them with resources they need to survive. But you are also benefiting from their knowledge and goods. The relationship is genuinely mutualistic. This is a model for how post-conflict societies can rebuild. Not through one side dominating the other, not through extraction and exploitation, but through fair exchange that benefits all parties. The player doesn't demand special prices because the Dwarf and Krobus are desperate. The Dwarf and Krobus don't overcharge because the player needs what they sell. It's honest trade, the foundation of peaceful coexistence. The question of documentation and historical record is significant. Who will write the history of the elemental wars? The dwarves have their version, the shadow people have theirs. Neither is entirely accurate. Both are colored by trauma and perspective. The wizard knows some of the history, but even his knowledge is incomplete, filtered through whatever sources he has access to. The player, as an outsider who befriends both sides, might be the only one capable of collecting a more complete picture. The artifacts donated to the museum, the conversations with Krobus and the dwarf, the observations in the mines and volcano dungeon, all of these pieces can be assembled into something approaching objective history. But objectivity is difficult when dealing with such emotionally charged events. The player's history of the elemental wars would necessarily be provisional, incomplete, acknowledged as limited. But it would also be more balanced than either side's version, and that balance might be valuable for any future attempts at broader reconciliation. The technological and magical knowledge that has been lost represents incalculable waste. The dwarves at their height had capabilities far beyond current human technology in the Ferngil Republic. If that knowledge could be recovered and shared, humanity could benefit enormously. Imagine mining operations that are safer and more efficient using dwarven techniques. Imagine medical applications of dwarven technology. The same applies to shadow people magic. Their understanding of the void, of dimensional physics, of magical manipulation of reality, could revolutionize human magical practice. But this knowledge is locked away, mostly lost, and what remains is held by survivors who have reason to be cautious about sharing with outsiders. Building enough trust for meaningful knowledge transfer would require time and patient relationship building. It would require proving that humans won't simply exploit the knowledge for destructive purposes. This is another long-term project that begins with the simple friendship the player offers. The monsters in the mines present an ethical dilemma that becomes more complex with understanding of the elemental wars. The shadow brutes might be sentient beings, degraded by trauma and isolation but still possessing some core of personhood. Is killing them justified self-defense, or is it contributing to the genocide of an already nearly extinct species? The game mechanics require you to fight these creatures to progress, but the lore suggests they might not be simple monsters but tragic victims of the war. This creates cognitive dissonance that is itself interesting. You are simultaneously befriending Krobus while killing his species' relatives in the mines. Krobus never comments on this directly, but the implication is disturbing. Does he know? Does he accept it as necessary? Or does he remain silent about something that pains him because he needs your friendship too much to risk confrontation? The shadow shamans, with their apparent ability to use magic defensively and offensively, raise similar questions. They are actively hostile, attacking with apparent intent to kill. But are they attacking because they are evil, or because from their perspective you are an invader, another in a long line of outsiders who have brought nothing but death to their people? From the shadow shaman's perspective, you are identical to the dwarven miners who destroyed their civilization. You descend into their darkness, you extract their resources, you kill their people. The fact that you don't know the history or intend the same outcomes doesn't change the material reality from their viewpoint. This is uncomfortable but important. Good intentions don't erase harmful impacts. The player is, regardless of personal motivation, participating in systems that harmed the shadow people and dwarves, mining the ruins of their civilizations for profit, fighting the degraded survivors, treating the underground as resources to be exploited rather than as memorial to be respected. But complete withdrawal is not clearly the answer either. If humans abandoned the mines entirely out of respect for the history there, what would happen? The monsters would still be there, the ruins would still decay, the artifacts would be lost to time. Krobus and the dwarf would lose their primary source of income and social connection. Sometimes engagement, even imperfect engagement that carries ethical complications, is better than abandonment. The key is engaging consciously, with awareness of the complexities and complications, with respect for what was lost and what remains. The player who learns the lore and thinks about these implications is engaging more ethically than one who simply mines thoughtlessly. Knowledge creates responsibility. The seasonal cycle of Stardew Valley, the constant return of spring bringing renewal, offers a counterpoint to the apparent permanence of the underground ruins. On the surface, nothing is permanent. Crops grow and die. Seasons change. The community evolves. But underground, in the mines, everything seems frozen in the moment the civilizations fell. The same monsters in the same locations. The same artifacts scattered about. The same ruins neither restored nor completely eroded. This timeless quality of the underground reinforces its nature as memorial, as a place where time stopped when the war ended. But perhaps human presence, the player's regular visits, begins to change even this. The mines are being cleared of monsters. The artifacts are being removed to the museum. Slowly, gradually, the underground is being transformed from battlefield frozen in time to something else. A place that is remembered but not preserved in amber. A place that can be integrated into the present rather than remaining locked in the past. The emotional labor required of Krobus and the dwarf to maintain even their fragile peace should not be underestimated. Every day they choose to honor the seal of promise is an active choice, a victory over instinct and cultural programming and personal pain. They are doing work, hard psychological and emotional work, constantly. The player's friendship helps, provides motivation and support, but ultimately the work is theirs. They must manage their trauma responses, their anger, their grief, every single day. When the dwarf hears about something happening in the sewers, they must push down the instinct to investigate whether Krobus is involved. When Krobus hears someone mention the mines, he must manage his fear that dwarven forces might be reorganizing for a new assault. These are not rational fears given current circumstances, but trauma is not rational. It creates hypervigilance, catastrophic thinking, defensive reactions to perceived threats that may not be real. Learning to distinguish between past danger and present safety is a long, difficult process. The concept of generational healing is relevant if either species has younger members. Children born after the war's end would not have direct memories of the conflict, but they would absorb their parents' trauma, fears, and hatreds, breaking the transmission of trauma across generations requires conscious effort from the parent generation. Krobus and the dwarf, by choosing peace, are doing this work. They are modeling different responses, creating new possibilities. If young dwarves or shadow people exist and observe these two survivors choosing peace despite everything, those young ones might internalize different lessons than previous generations did. They might learn that while the past was terrible, the future need not repeat it. This is how cycles break, slowly, imperfectly, one generation at a time. The wizard's casting of the Seal of Promise represents a fascinating use of magic to manage social conflict. Magic in Stardew Valley is often whimsical or mysterious, but here it serves a deeply practical purpose. It enforces an agreement that both parties want to make but might not be able to maintain without external support. This is similar to real-world interventions in conflict situations where third parties help establish structures and systems that support peace even when emotions run high. The Magic Seal is a fantasy version of peace treaties, monitoring systems, conflict resolution mechanisms. It doesn't change how Krobus and the dwarf feel about each other or about the past, but it prevents those feelings from leading to violence. And by preventing violence, it creates space for other possibilities to emerge. Time to process, time to heal, time for the raw edges of trauma to dull enough that interaction becomes possible. The broader question of how many such sealed promises might be necessary haunts the narrative. If large populations of both species exist, you couldn't magically seal all of them. The wizard's intervention works because it involves two individuals in a specific confrontation. Scaling up to hundreds or thousands of individuals to entire communities would require different approaches. This is where the personal peace between Krobus and the dwarf becomes a model but not a complete solution. Their peace shows it's possible, but achieving peace at scale requires building institutions, creating economic interdependence, fostering cultural exchange, developing shared projects that require cooperation. The hard work of peace is structural, not just individual. The silence of the minds, that particular quality of quiet that exists in the deep levels, is the silence of absence. So many voices, dwarven and shadow people, that no longer speak. So many stories that died with their tellers. So many songs unsung, innovations never developed, children never born. The war consumed all of that potential and left only emptiness. When you stand in the deepest levels of the mines or descend far into Skull Cavern, if you pay attention, you can feel that absence. It's not peaceful. It's haunted, not by literal ghosts, but by the weight of all that was lost. This is why the elemental wars matter even to players who never learn the details. The atmosphere of the deep mines carries the truth even when the specific history is unknown. You feel that something terrible happened here, even if you don't know what. Krobus's willingness to live on the surface as your roommate represents the most radical rejection of the war's legacy. He is literally leaving the underground, the realm of shadows and darkness that defined both his species and the conflict. He is exposing himself to light, to openness, to a world completely different from everything his people have known. This is extraordinary courage. It's choosing transformation over safety, growth over stagnation, connection over isolation. The fact that the game allows this option, that Krobus can become your roommate and live peacefully on a surface farm, is a powerful statement about the possibility of change. No one is locked into their past. No one is defined entirely by their trauma or their culture. Individuals can choose differently, can step into new lives, can become something their ancestors might not recognize. This is simultaneously hopeful and melancholy. Hopeful because it demonstrates possibility. Melancholy because Krobus becoming part of the surface world might mean the final dissolution of Shadow People culture. If he is the last one capable of maintaining traditions, and he chooses to leave that all behind, what remains? The preservation of cultural memory becomes a critical question. The museum holds artifacts, but artifacts without context are just objects. The meaning of these items, their significance within Dwarven and Shadow People cultures, that knowledge resides with Krobus and the dwarf. When they die, if there are no others, that knowledge dies too. The artifacts will remain in cases, labeled with basic descriptions, but their true meaning will be lost. This is another form of extinction, the death not just of individuals but of the cultural knowledge they carry. It underscores the importance of the player's interactions with them. Every conversation, every story they share, every piece of knowledge they reveal is potentially the last time that information will be spoken. The player becomes an archivist by default, the inheritor of cultural memories that have no other inheritors. The question remains whether the elemental wars were inevitable given the circumstances of two very different civilizations competing for the same underground space. Could it have gone differently? Alternate history scenarios are always speculative, but consider this possibility. Imagine if the dwarves, upon first encountering shadow people, had recognized them as intelligent beings and sought communication. Imagine if shadow people, upon first encountering dwarven mining operations, had attempted to establish boundaries through negotiation rather than defense through force. The war might not have happened. They might have established treaties, divided territory, created mutually beneficial trade relationships. The dwarves had technology the shadow people might have valued. The shadow people had magical knowledge the dwarves might have needed. The foundation for partnership existed if both sides had been able to see past fear and assumptions. But this assumes a level of communication and mutual recognition that may not have been possible. The dwarves, as technological beings, may not have initially recognized shadow people as intelligent. They might have mistaken them for dangerous animals or magical phenomena. Shadow people, as beings from the void, may not have understood physical material beings like dwarves at all. Their frameworks of understanding might have been so different that meaningful communication was impossible until both sides had learned enough about each other. And by the time they had learned enough, too much blood had been shed, too many grievances had accumulated. The window for peaceful resolution closed before either side knew it was open. This is a tragedy of mutual incomprehension, of misunderstanding escalating to violence before clarity could be achieved. The role of fear in starting and perpetuating the conflict cannot be overemphasized. The dwarves were aliens on a strange world, crashed, struggling to survive. Every unknown was a potential threat. The shadow people were refugees from a void catastrophe, traumatized, seeking safety in a hostile physical plane. Every intrusion was an echo of whatever disaster drove them from their home. Both were operating from positions of fear, survival instinct, trauma. In such conditions, violence becomes a default response because it feels safer than the vulnerability required for communication and negotiation. Fear is the ultimate obstacle to peace. Not hatred, interestingly. You can make peace with people you hate if you understand that peace benefits you. But peace with people you fear requires trusting that they won't hurt you if you drop your defenses, and trauma makes that trust nearly impossible. This is why the wizard's intervention is so crucial. He provides external security. The magical seal means neither Krobus nor the dwarf has to trust the other's good intentions. They only have to trust the wizard's magic. This outsourcing of trust makes peace possible when direct trust is not yet feasible. Over time, if the peace holds, actual trust might develop. They might reach a point where the magical seal is no longer necessary because they have proven to each other through years of peaceful coexistence that the threat is past. But initially, the external enforcement is essential. Many real-world peace processes have similar structures, third-party guarantors and monitoring systems that provide security while direct trust builds. The mines as a tourist destination or historical site represents a possible future that is both promising and problematic. Imagine if Pelican Town decided to market the mines as a historical attraction, offering tours of the dwarven ruins and the battlefields of the elemental wars. This would bring economic benefit to the town and raise awareness of this important history. But it would also further commodify the suffering of the dwarves and shadow people, turning their tragedy into entertainment for humans. The ethical line between educational remembrance and exploitative tourism is thin and easily crossed. Any development of the mines for broader public access would need to be done carefully, with input from Krobus and the dwarf, with respect for what the space represents. But complete closure is also problematic. Limiting access to only one farmer means the history remains obscure, known to few, easily forgotten. Balance is needed, ways to honor and remember without exploit, ways to preserve without fossilizing. The ultimate question the elemental wars pose to players is one of responsibility. What do we owe to the past? What do we owe to the survivors of historical traumas we didn't cause and can't fix? The easy answer is nothing, that the past is past and we should focus on the present. But the game suggests otherwise. It suggests we have responsibility to remember, to understand, to act with awareness of historical context. It suggests that kindness to individuals carrying historical trauma is not just nice but necessary. It suggests that peace, however fragile and imperfect, is always worth pursuing and supporting. These are not revolutionary ideas, but they are important ones. And by embedding them in the optional lore of a farming simulator, Stardew Valley ensures that players who engage deeply with the game will encounter these ideas in a context where they feel meaningful rather than preachy. The elemental wars ultimately serve as testament to both the destructive capacity of intelligent beings and their capacity for resilience and change. Two civilizations destroyed each other, but individual survivors found ways to persist, adapt, and even move toward peace. The darkness of the history makes the light of current possibilities more precious. Every day Krobus and the dwarf choose not to fight is a victory over the weight of centuries. Every friendship the player builds with them is a statement that the past, while powerful, need not determine the future. Every artifact preserved in the museum is a promise that even when civilizations fall, something of their story remains to teach future generations. The wars were terrible, the losses staggering, the suffering almost incomprehensible. But the story didn't end in mutual extinction. It ended in survival, choice, and the possibility, however uncertain, of something better. That is the legacy worth carrying forward from the depths of Stardew Valley's mines into the light. The interconnected nature of conflicts in Stardew Valley's world creates a web of historical causality that extends far beyond the elemental wars themselves. Consider how the war might have influenced early human settlement patterns in the region. If humans arrived in the valley while the underground conflict was still raging, they would have experienced mysterious earthquakes, strange sounds from below ground, possibly encounters with fleeing refugees from either side. This would have shaped human mythology and culture. Perhaps the old superstitions some villagers hold, the fear of the mines that keeps most people away, the reluctance to explore deep underground, these might all be cultural memories of a time when the underground was genuinely dangerous due to active warfare. The timing of human settlement relative to the war's end is significant. If humans arrived after the war concluded, they encountered an underground already devastated, already filled with ruins and traumatized survivors. If they arrived while the war was ongoing, they might have inadvertently influenced its course. Human presence on the surface, human use of the surface mines, human exploitation of resources, all of this would have added pressure to both warring peoples. It might have forced them deeper, compressed their territories, increased competition for limited space and resources. In this reading, humans didn't start the elemental wars, but human activity might have made it worse, made it last longer, made the ultimate devastation more complete. This introduces an uncomfortable possibility of human complicity in the near extinction of both species. Not through deliberate action, but through the ordinary activities of settlement and resource extraction. Humans needed metal for tools and buildings. They mined where they could. They didn't know or didn't care that their mining operations were intruding on territories that were already contested battlegrounds. This is a pattern repeated throughout human history, colonial powers arriving in regions and exploiting resources without regard for the existing populations and conflicts. Stardew Valley, for all its cozy aesthetic, might be telling a post-colonial story where the player inherits land and systems built on the displacement and near-destruction of indigenous non-human populations. The Adventurers Guild presents an interesting case study in human-dwarf shadow people relations. Marlin and Gil, the guild members, are clearly aware that the mines contain intelligent beings. They refer to monsters, but they also must know about the dwarf's shop in the mines. Do they know about Krobus? Have they encountered shadow people and simply categorized them as monsters to be killed rather than people to be understood? The guild's mission, protecting humanity from underground threats, makes sense from a human perspective. But from the perspective of shadow people who survived the elemental wars only to face a new threat from human adventurers, the guild might look like another invading force, another group trying to exterminate them. The player's role as an adventurer sanctioned by the guild becomes more complex with this understanding. Every shadow brute you kill for guild bounties might be a survivor of genocide facing a new genocidal threat. The guild rewards you for killing them, incentivizes their destruction, treats them as vermin to be cleared out rather than beings with rights to exist. This is uncomfortable. The game never explicitly condemns the player for this, but the lore creates space for players to condemn themselves, to recognize that their actions are participating in systems of violence even when those actions are mechanically rewarded. Marlon's history adds another layer. He is an experienced adventurer who has clearly spent decades in the mines. What has he seen? What does he know about the elemental wars? His laconic personality and reluctance to speak about the past suggests he carries knowledge he doesn't share. Perhaps he has witnessed things in the deep mines that haunt him. Perhaps he has killed beings he later realized were intelligent. Perhaps he knows that the guild's mission, while framed as protecting humanity, is also contributing to the extinction of other peoples. His silence might be guilt, or it might be pragmatism, the recognition that humans need the mine's resources and cannot afford to acknowledge the moral costs of obtaining them. The economic dependence of Pelican Town on mining operations creates structural incentives against recognizing the full personhood of underground peoples. If shadow people and dwarves were acknowledged as intelligent beings with territorial rights, human mining would become much more complicated, perhaps impossible. Treaties would need to be negotiated, compensation paid, access limited. It's easier economically to classify them as monsters, to treat their territories as empty wilderness available for exploitation. This is not unique to Stardew Valley. Real-world resource extraction has always involved similar moral gymnastics, categorizing indigenous peoples as less than human to justify taking their lands and resources. But the game also offers alternatives. Your farm becomes successful without requiring extensive mining. You can choose to minimize your time in the mines, to take only what you need, to treat each descent as entering someone else's territory rather than claiming it as your own. You can befriend Krobus and the Dwarf, recognizing their personhood and treating them with respect. These choices don't change the game's mechanics, but they change the meaning of your actions. They represent conscious ethical engagement with the complications the lore reveals. This is sophisticated game design, creating space for player agency in constructing moral meaning without forcing a particular interpretation. The possibility of peaceful coexistence between humans, dwarves, and shadow people remains largely unexplored in the game, but represents the hopeful endpoint of the narrative arc that begins with the elemental wars. Imagine a future where Krobus isn't hiding in sewers but living openly in town, where the dwarf isn't isolated in the mines but trading regularly in the surface market, where shadow people and dwarves work together on joint projects, combining their different strengths, where humans learn dwarven engineering and shadow magic, and share their own agricultural knowledge in return. This vision requires dramatic changes in attitudes and structures, but it's not impossible. The player's friendships with Krobus and the dwarf prove that cross-species connection is possible. Scaling that to community level would be the work of generations, but all long-term change begins with individual connections. The children of Pelican Town, Vincent and Jazz, represent the generation that could build this different future. They are growing up in a world where at least one human, the player, treats non-human intelligences as equals. If they observe the player's friendships with Krobus and the dwarf, they will internalize different assumptions than their parents' generation holds. To them, it might seem natural that shadow people and dwarves are people deserving respect. They won't carry the old fears and prejudices. They could be the ones who, as adults, push for formal recognition and rights for non-human intelligent species. Social change often happens generationally, with younger people embracing values their elders resist. The role of education and knowledge dissemination becomes critical for any peaceful future. The museum's collection of artifacts needs context, interpretation, storytelling. Gunther could develop exhibits that explain the elemental wars, that present the perspectives of both sides, that help visitors understand this history. Schools could teach about non-human civilizations alongside human history. The library could stock books written by or about dwarves and shadow people. These educational interventions would gradually shift cultural understanding, creating a society where the default assumption is that different intelligent species deserve coexistence rather than one where non-humans are exotic curiosities or threats to be managed. The wizard's tower and his extensive library might already contain much of this knowledge. He could be a resource for education if he chose to be, but his isolationist tendencies, his preference for keeping humans at arm's length, limits his impact. Perhaps part of the player's long-term influence could be encouraging the wizard to be more public with his knowledge, to write books accessible to ordinary people, to teach magic and history to interested students. The wizard as public intellectual rather than reclusive mystic could transform the valley's understanding of its own past and the peoples who share its space. The question of reparations and justice for the harms done during and after the elemental wars is thorny but unavoidable. The dwarves lost nearly everything in the war. The shadow people lost nearly everything in the war. And in the aftermath, humans have exploited the ruins of both civilizations for profit. What, if anything, does contemporary human society owe to the survivors? Pure restitution is impossible. You cannot give back lives lost or civilizations destroyed. But meaningful support could take other forms. Protected territories where remaining underground peoples can live without human interference. Financial support from mining profits to Krobus and the Dwarf and any other survivors who are discovered. Political representation, giving non-human peoples a voice in decisions that affect them. These are difficult conversations that the game doesn't explicitly require, but the lore creates space for players to imagine. The long-term ecological implications of the elemental wars and subsequent human mining deserve consideration. The underground ecosystem has been disrupted for centuries. Species that evolved in stable environments were suddenly exposed to massive warfare. Then, abandonment, then new exploitation by humans. The monsters that now inhabit the mines might be invasive species that moved into ecological niches left empty by the war. Or they might be native species that exploded in population when their natural predators, the dwarves and shadow people who managed the ecosystem, were removed. Restoring ecological balance underground might require active management, the kind of knowledge that only dwarven and shadow people survivors possess. This creates another reason for human-dwarf shadow people cooperation. Humans want safe, productive mines. Achieving that requires the ecological expertise of the peoples who lived there before. The spiritual or metaphysical implications of the elemental wars touch on deeper questions about the nature of Stardew Valley's universe. The shadow people came from the void, a dimension beyond the physical plane. Their presence in the physical world represents a breach between dimensions. The catastrophe that forced them here suggests instability in the fundamental structure of reality. If dimensions can catastrophically collapse or intersect, what does that mean for long-term stability? Could another catastrophe occur? Could shadow people be forced to flee again? Or could the void itself become accessible, offering a route for refugees to return home or for curious explorers to investigate? The dwarves, if they are truly aliens, represent another form of dimensional or at least interstellar intersection. Their spacecraft, assuming it exists buried deep underground, might still contain technology functional or at least recoverable. Advanced enough species to achieve interstellar travel would have capabilities far beyond anything seen in the game. If that spacecraft could be found, studied, possibly reactivated, it would transform everything. But it would also raise profound questions. Do the dwarves have a homeworld? Are there more dwarves there? Might they come looking for their lost colony? First contact with advanced alien civilizations is a staple of science fiction, and Stardew Valley's lore hints that such contact might already have occurred, with disastrous consequences for the dwarves who crashed. The Junimos add yet another layer to this multidimensional cosmology. They are spirit beings connected to nature but also capable of interacting with the physical world. They preceded human settlement and have their own agendas. How did they relate to the elemental wars? Did they try to intervene? Did they simply withdraw to the forest and wait for the violence to end? Their connection to Yoba, the creator deity, suggests they might have authority or knowledge beyond what they share. Perhaps the community center restoration is not just about bringing humans together, but about establishing a model for peaceful coexistence that could extend to dwarves and shadow people. The Junimos teaching humans cooperation and community as foundation for broader interspecies cooperation. This web of peoples, conflicts, histories, and possibilities makes Stardew Valley's lore remarkably rich for a game that appears on the surface to be about farming turnips. The elemental wars are the dark heart of this lore, the traumatic event that shaped the underground world and continues to influence everyone who enters it. Understanding this history transforms the player's relationship to the game. Mining becomes archaeology and, unfortunately, grave robbing. Combat becomes complicated ethical territory. Friendship with Krobus and the Dwarf becomes participation in post-conflict reconciliation. The game rewards engagement with this depth while never requiring it, allowing players to choose their level of investment in these themes. The fact that this lore is optional, that players can complete the game without ever learning about the elemental wars, is significant. It suggests that these histories exist whether we know them or not. Ignorance doesn't erase past violence. The ruins in the mines are there regardless of whether players understand what they represent. The trauma Krobus and the dwarf carry is real whether the player befriends them or ignores them. This mirrors real-world dynamics where historical traumas persist in communities and landscapes even when later arrivals remain ignorant of them. The game rewards players who choose to learn, who seek out the hidden dialogues and rare books and secret cutscenes. It rewards curiosity and engagement with difficult histories. The emotional resonance of the Elemental Wars narrative comes from its refusal to provide easy answers or comfortable resolutions. There are no heroes, no villains, just survivors carrying trauma and making difficult choices. There is no justice, just the recognition that pursuing justice would require perpetuating violence. There is no forgetting, just the choice to not let memory determine every action. This is mature storytelling that trusts players to sit with complexity and discomfort. It doesn't lecture or moralize overtly. It presents situations and allows players to draw their own conclusions. The mines themselves stand as perhaps the most powerful element of this narrative. They are not just gameplay spaces but memorials, museums, graveyards, battlefields, and cautionary tales all at once. Every level descended is a journey deeper into history, into darkness, into the consequences of conflict. The progression from relative safety in upper levels to extreme danger in the depths mirrors the progression of the elemental wars from initial skirmishes to catastrophic total warfare. The increasing rewards at greater depths represent the terrible equation of extraction economies. Greater profit requires greater risk and often greater violence. The player navigating this space is forced to reckon with these equations, whether consciously or not. And at the deepest depths, in the lowest levels of Skull Cavern where few players venture and fewer still spend significant time, there is a sense of approaching something fundamental. Not a final answer or ultimate truth, but the edge of what can be known. The cavern has no true bottom, keeps descending. There is always another level, always more depth, always more darkness. This endless descent mirrors the way historical trauma and violence can feel bottomless, can seem to go down forever, can threaten to consume everything. But the player can choose to stop descending, can choose to return to the surface, can choose to bring what they've learned into the light rather than remaining in the depths. This choice to return, to emerge, to continue living despite confronting darkness, is its own form of hope. The Elemental Wars narrative, fully assembled from its scattered pieces, tells a story about the costs of conflict, the possibility of healing, the weight of history, and the responsibility of the present to remember the past while not being trapped by it. It tells the story in a game about farming because the act of farming, of cultivating growth in the aftermath of devastation, of patiently working to produce life and abundance, is itself a response to violence and death. The player's farm flourishes on land that has seen ancient wars, human conflicts, corporate exploitation, and personal tragedies. Yet crops still grow, animals thrive, community builds, life persists and even flourishes. This is not because the past doesn't matter, but because living well becomes a form of resistance to the forces that create devastation. The choice to befriend Krobus and the dwarf, to learn their stories, to support their fragile peace, to treat them as individuals deserving respect and kindness. This is farming applied to relationships. Patient cultivation of growth where violence had tried to ensure nothing could ever grow again. And that, perhaps, is the ultimate meaning hidden in the depths of Stardew Valley's mines. That even in the darkest places, even after the worst devastation, the choice to cultivate life, connection, and peace remains possible. Difficult, yes. Complicated, absolutely. But possible. And possibility, in the end, is everything. The void catastrophe that forced the Shadow People into the physical plane remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in Stardew Valley's lore. Krobus speaks of it in the vaguest terms, describing it as a great catastrophe that allowed spirits from the void to cross into the physical plane. But what was this catastrophe? What is the void itself? And why did crossing into the physical plane become necessary rather than simply desirable? These questions have no definitive answers, only theories that attempt to piece together fragments of evidence scattered throughout the valley. The void, as best we can understand it, is a dimension or plane of existence separate from physical reality. It is not hell or punishment, despite its ominous name. Krobus, who came from the void, is capable of goodness, friendship, even devotion to Yoba. The void is described more as a realm of nothingness, a space where the normal rules of physics do not apply, where matter as we understand it does not exist. Shadow people in their native form were beings of pure energy or spirit, existing without physical bodies, without the constraints of matter. The void was their natural habitat, the place where their species evolved or came into being. The catastrophe that forced them to flee this dimension must have been apocalyptic in scale. For an entire species to abandon their home dimension, to risk the dangerous crossing into a fundamentally different plane of existence, the threat they faced must have been existential. Several theories attempt to explain what might have caused such devastation. One possibility connects to the book of Yoba's creation myth. Yoba, the creator deity, is described as swirling golden light into a vortex, forming a hole from which the physical world sprouted. This hole, this tear in the fabric of reality created during the act of creation itself, might have destabilized the void. If the void existed before physical reality, if it was the primordial state of existence, then Yoba's act of creation, bringing matter and physical laws into being, would have been a catastrophic disruption to the void's nature. Imagine existing as a being of pure energy in a dimension where energy is all that exists, where darkness and void are the natural state. Then suddenly, without warning, a hole tears open and light, physical matter, entirely alien forces pour through. The void dimension might have begun collapsing, unable to maintain stability in the face of this fundamental alteration to the cosmic order. Shadow people, facing the choice between remaining in a collapsing dimension or crossing through into the strange new physical plane, chose survival. They crossed over, but the crossing was not easy. They had to take physical form or semi-physical form, becoming living. Shadows that exist in the boundary between energy and matter. This transformation was traumatic, a forced adaptation to conditions completely unlike their natural state. Another theory, more sinister, suggests that the catastrophe was not natural but caused by the dwarves. If we accept the hypothesis that dwarves are aliens whose spacecraft crashed into this world, their arrival might have been the catastrophe Krobus speaks of. Advanced, spacefaring technology would require energy sources beyond anything naturally occurring. Some fans theorize that dwarven power systems utilize void energy, somehow tapping into the void dimension to power their technologies. If the dwarven spacecraft was using void energy and then crashed, the massive release of that energy, the rupture of the ship's containment systems, could have torn a hole between dimensions. The crash would have simultaneously brought the dwarves into the underground and forced the shadow people to flee their collapsing dimension into the same space. This theory has the narrative appeal of making the dwarves and shadow people's conflict more inevitable. They would not just be two species competing for territory. They would be victim and cause. The dwarves' arrival literally destroyed the shadow people's home, and then the dwarves proceeded to claim the underground territory where the shadow people had taken refuge. From this perspective, the shadow people's hostility would be entirely justified. They lost their home dimension because of dwarven technology, then lost their ancestral homeland in the physical plane to dwarven expansion. The dwarves might not have intended any of this, might not even have known shadow people existed before the crash, but intention doesn't erase harm. This reading makes the elemental wars even more tragic. A war caused by accident, by unintended consequences, by technological catastrophe that neither side wanted but both paid for with centuries of bloodshed. A third theory, more metaphysical, suggests that the void catastrophe was an internal event, something that happened within void society itself. Perhaps shadow people culture developed void magic to incredible heights, manipulation of their own dimension's fundamental forces. Perhaps they attempted something too ambitious, a magical working or experiment that went catastrophically wrong. The void equivalent of a nuclear disaster, except instead of radiation, it destabilized the dimensional fabric itself. Some shadow people might have survived in the void, adapted to the post-catastrophe conditions. Others, like Krobus's people, fled to the physical plane. This would explain why Krobus speaks of the catastrophe with such vagueness. It's not that knowledge has been lost. It's that his people carry collective shame about their role in causing it. Whatever the true cause, the result is clear. Shadow people were forced from their home into a dimension that is fundamentally hostile to their nature. Light, which doesn't exist in the void, is painful and dangerous to them. Physical matter, which they never had to navigate before, becomes an obstacle. The very act of maintaining their semi-physical forms requires constant effort. They are eternal refugees, beings who cannot return home because home no longer exists or no longer recognizes them. This explains much about their culture as we see it. The fierce territorialism that contributed to the elemental wars makes sense for people who have already lost one home and cannot bear to lose another. The hostility of shadow brutes in the mines is the response of traumatized refugees defending the last safe space they have. Their aggression is not proof of inherent evil but evidence of desperate fear. The void itself remains partially accessible even after the catastrophe. Void essence can be collected from void spirits and shadow brutes in the mines. Void eggs can be obtained and hatched into void chickens. The wizard requests void essence for his magical work. This suggests that the barrier between dimensions, while no longer catastrophically broken, remains permeable. Energy from the void can leak through into the physical plane. Some creatures in the mines might be void entities that crossed over after the shadow people, drawn by the same dimensional weakness. Or they might be physical plane creatures that have been transformed by exposure to void energy, mutated into new forms. The void's influence on the valley extends beyond just shadow people. The strange fertility of the soil, the way crops grow with unusual vigor, the constant respawning of resources in the mines, all of this might be explained by void energy seeping into the region. The crash site of the dwarven spacecraft, if it used void energy, would be a point source of dimensional contamination. Void energy promoting growth and change, destabilizing normal physical laws, creating an environment where the impossible becomes possible. This would explain why the valley is so special, why Yoba seems to take particular interest in it, why magic is more accessible here than in other regions. The valley sits on a dimensional weak point, a place where the void and physical plane overlap. The ethical implications of using void-related items become more complex with this. Understanding. When you collect void essence or raise void chickens, you are interacting with remnants of a destroyed dimension, with the homeland of the shadow people that no longer exists in any meaningful form. Is this exploitation? Is it preservation? Void chickens might be the last living connections to what the void was before the catastrophe, creatures that carry void energy in a stable, non-threatening form. By raising them, you might be keeping alive something that would otherwise be lost. Or you might be commodifying tragedy, turning the destruction of a dimension into a farming quirk. The game doesn't judge, but it provides enough information for players to wrestle with these questions. The wizard's interest in void essence is particularly significant. He requests it for magical purposes, suggesting that void energy has properties useful for arcane work. This makes sense. Void energy, coming from a dimension without physical laws, would be a wild card in magical formulations, capable of bending or breaking the normal rules of the physical plane. But it would also be dangerous. Void energy used carelessly could create more dimensional instability, could widen the tears between planes, could potentially cause another catastrophe. The wizard, one hopes, understands these dangers and uses void essence responsibly. But his history with the witch, his clear knowledge of dangerous magic, suggests he operates in morally gray areas. The void essence you provide might be used for good purposes, or it might contribute to magical experiments that carry their own risks. The connection between Yoba worship and shadow people is fascinating and often overlooked. Krobus is devoted to Yoba despite coming from the void, despite his people's suffering. This suggests that shadow people theology recognizes Yoba as creator even of the void, or perhaps especially of the void. If Yoba existed before physical creation, if Yoba originated in the void and then created the physical plane as the myths describe, then Yoba is fundamentally connected to shadow people origins. The void might not have been created by Yoba, but was Yoba's original state before choosing to create. The catastrophe that forced shadow people into the physical plane might even be interpreted by some as Yoba's will, a forced migration that would eventually allow shadow people to experience physical creation and find their place in the broader cosmic order. This theological reading would make shadow people's suffering a form of divine trial or transformation. They lost their original home but gained the opportunity to exist in the created world, to interact with matter and physical beings, to grow and change in ways that would have been impossible in the void. Krobus's peaceful nature, his ability to form friendships, his choice to live among physical beings rather than retreating entirely into darkness, might represent the positive outcome of this transformation. He has become something his ancestors in the void could never have been, a being that bridges dimensions that exists in both states. Simultaneously, this is not to minimize the tragedy of the void catastrophe or the suffering it caused, but to suggest that shadow people theology might find meaning in that suffering, might see it as purposeful rather than random or cruel. The dwarven perspective on the void would be entirely different. If their technology uses void energy, they understand it as a power source, a resource to be harnessed. They might not even conceive of it as a place where beings live, might see it as empty potential energy waiting to be tapped. This fundamental misunderstanding, seeing the void as resource rather than homeland, would have contributed to the conflict. The dwarves exploiting void energy, if that is what they do, would be seen by shadow people as desecration, as violating the remains of their destroyed world. Every dwarven machine powered by void energy would be running on the remnants of shadow people's home. The horror of that, the violation, would fuel hatred that mere territorial disputes could never achieve. But perhaps some dwarven engineers, late in the war or after its end, came to understand what void energy actually represented. Perhaps they felt guilt, horror at unknowingly powering their civilization with the ruins of another people's dimension. Perhaps some tried to stop using void energy to find alternative power sources, and this contributed to the loss of dwarven technology. If the most advanced systems relied on void energy and that became morally untenable, those systems would have been shut down, their knowledge suppressed. The dwarven technological collapse might not be entirely due to population loss from the war. Some of it might be deliberate abandonment of technologies that were built on atrocity. The ultimate fate of the void dimension remains unknown. Is it completely destroyed, collapsed into nothingness, gone forever? Or does it exist in damaged form, a broken dimension that might someday be repaired? Could shadow people with sufficient knowledge and power return to the void? Would they want to? Krobus has adapted to physical existence, has found value in it. Perhaps other shadow people have as well. Return to the void might no longer be desirable even if it were possible. They have changed, transformed by centuries in the physical plane. They are no longer pure void spirits. They are something new, hybrid beings that belong fully to neither dimension. This liminal existence defines their current state, caught between worlds, never quite fitting in either. The question of whether more void catastrophes could occur haunts the edges of the lore. If dimensional barriers can break once, they can break again. If the void and physical plane can intersect catastrophically, other dimensions might also exist, might also be vulnerable to similar events. The universe of Stardew Valley might be far more complex than it appears, with multiple dimensions layered upon each other, separated by increasingly fragile barriers. Every use of void energy, every bit of dimensional magic, every manipulation of forces that bridge planes, risks weakening those barriers further. The wizard's magic, shadow shaman spells, even Junimo magic that seems to pull resources from nowhere, all of this might be stressing the dimensional fabric in ways that could eventually cause ruptures. The player's role in this broader cosmic drama is unclear but potentially significant. You interact with void energy, with shadow people, with dwarven technology. You bridge different communities and species. You witness and help resolve conflicts that span dimensions and civilizations. Are you simply a farmer who stumbled into these situations? Or is there something else at play? The mysterious Mr. Chi, who observes your progress and sets challenges, hints at deeper patterns. Perhaps you were drawn to the valley for reasons beyond escaping corporate life. Perhaps your ability to befriend both Krobus and the dwarf, to handle void energy safely, to navigate multiple conflicts, marks you as someone important to the valley's future. Someone who can help heal not just interpersonal wounds, but dimensional ones. This connects to the community center restoration on a grander scale. The Junimo's work isn't just about fixing a building. It's about restoring balance, harmony, connection. These are principles that could apply at any scale, from interpersonal to interdimensional. If void energy and physical reality are out of balance, if dimensional barriers are too thin or too thick, the same principles of restoration that apply to the community center might apply to fixing these larger problems. Bring different elements together in right proportion. Create harmony between disparate forces. Build bridges while maintaining necessary boundaries. The Junimos might be teaching lessons that have implications far beyond Pelican Town. The void catastrophe also raises questions about time and causality in the Stardew Valley universe. When did it occur? Krobus says his people came here long ago, but long ago to an immortal or long-lived species might be very different than human timescales. Was the void catastrophe thousands of years in the past, before human civilization began? Or more recent, perhaps coinciding with other significant events in Valley history? If the dwarven crash caused the void catastrophe, then we have a rough timeline. The crash happened when it happened, the void broke, shadow people fled through, and dwarves started expanding underground, leading to first contact and eventually war. But if the catastrophe was unrelated to the dwarves, the timeline becomes much less clear. Some theorists propose that time works differently in the void than in the physical plane. What was experienced as gradual degradation over millennia by shadow people in the void might have manifested as sudden catastrophe when the dimensional boundary broke. The shadow people who crossed over might have experienced no subjective time passage, stepping from the dying void directly into the physical plane's past or present depending on when and where they emerged. This would explain some of the confusion around timing and causality. It would also mean that the void catastrophe is still ongoing in some sense, that the void dimension is still in the process of collapsing across its own nonlinear timeframe. Shadow people might still be fleeing it, emerging at different points in physical plane time, explaining why shadow creatures appear in the mine centuries after the main migration. They are not descendants of the original refugees. They are new refugees, still arriving from a catastrophe that from physical perspective happened long ago but from void perspective is still occurring. The mines themselves might be more than just the site of battles. They might be the actual point of crossing, the place where the dimensional barrier is thinnest, where void and physical plane most easily interpenetrate. This would explain why shadow creatures are so concentrated there. It's not just their preferred habitat. It's where they enter this world. Every shadow brewed in the mines might be a refugee, a survivor of the void catastrophe, newly arrived and confused and frightened. When you fight them, you are not clearing out entrenched populations. You are intercepting new arrivals, beings that have just experienced dimensional catastrophe and emerged into a hostile environment where they are immediately attacked. This reading makes combat in the mines even more ethically fraught. These are not monsters. These are traumatized refugees defending themselves against what they perceive as immediate threats. Krobus, having been in the physical plane longer, has had time to adapt, to learn the language and customs, to understand that not all physical beings are threats. The shadow brutes in the mines haven't had that time. They emerge, disoriented, and within moments encounter adventurers swinging swords. Of course they fight back. Of course they seem hostile. They have no framework for understanding that the physical plane contains the possibility of peace, of negotiation, of coexistence. All they know is the trauma of dimensional collapse and immediate violent confrontation. Given time, given safety, given the opportunity to adapt as Krobus has, they might also become peaceful. But they aren't given that chance. They are killed as monsters before they can become anything else. This creates a horrible cycle. Shadow people emerge from the void, encounter violence, respond with violence, get killed, reinforcing human and dwarf beliefs that shadow people are dangerous monsters that must be eliminated on sight. This justifies more violence, which creates more traumatized refugees who respond violently, which justifies more elimination. The cycle perpetuates itself, making peace impossible not because either side is fundamentally evil, but because the circumstances of first contact are always violent. Breaking this cycle would require creating safe arrival zones, places where shadow people emerging from the void are not immediately threatened, where they have time and space to orient themselves, to learn language and customs, to understand that peace is possible. The sewers where Krobus lives might be an accidental example of such a space, a place isolated enough that a shadow person could survive unmolested long enough to adapt. The technological and magical applications of understanding the void more completely are staggering. If researchers could safely study the void, understand its properties, learn how shadow people adapted to crossing dimensions, it could revolutionize everything. Dimensional travel might become possible, opening up other planes of existence for exploration. The energy crisis that presumably constrains dwarven technology could be solved with stable void energy extraction. New forms of magic could be developed that combine physical and void principles. Medical applications might allow treatment of conditions currently considered incurable by manipulating patients' connection to different dimensional states. The knowledge is all there, carried by shadow people like Krobus, but accessing it requires trust, safety, and time that the current situation does not allow. The void catastrophe also serves as cosmic-scale cautionary tale. Whether it was caused by natural dimensional instability, by Yoba's act of creation, by dwarven accident, or by shadow people's own magical experiments, the result is the same. An entire dimension destroyed or damaged beyond repair. An entire species made homeless refugees, suffering that ripples through centuries. It stands as warning about the dangers of power wielded without sufficient understanding of consequences. The dwarves learned a version of this lesson through the elemental wars, but the void catastrophe suggests the stakes can be even higher. You can destroy not just civilizations but entire planes of existence. The responsibility that comes with advanced technology or magic is immense, and failure to exercise that responsibility carefully can result in unthinkable devastation. For Krobus personally, the void catastrophe is foundational trauma that colors every aspect of his existence. He is a being without a home dimension, living in a world that is fundamentally wrong for his physiology, speaking a language that is not his native one, hiding from populations that see him as a monster. The catastrophe took everything from him, his home, likely his family, his entire civilization's future. That he can still function, still run a shop, still seek friendship, still find joy in small things, is testament to incredible resilience. But the cost of that resilience, the constant effort required to maintain it, should not be underestimated. Every day is hard for Krobus in ways that physical beings like the player or the dwarves cannot fully comprehend. His choice to keep living, keep trying, keep reaching out is heroic in the truest sense. The void remains even after catastrophe. Void energy still exists. Void essence can still be collected. Shadow people still emerge from somewhere. The dimension might be broken, but it is not gone. Something remains, whether ruins or remnants or some reduced sustainable form. Perhaps the void can recover given enough time, given removal of whatever stressors caused the catastrophe. Perhaps shadow people could participate in that healing, using their knowledge of both void and physical states to rebuild dimensional barriers, to stabilize the void, to eventually return home. This would require cooperation from physical plane beings as well. If the catastrophe was caused by dimensional intersection, healing it means managing that intersection more carefully, reducing the stress points where planes contact each other. The story of the void catastrophe, incomplete though our knowledge is, adds immense depth to Stardew Valley's cosmology. The world becomes not just a physical plane with magic, but a multidimensional reality where planes can intersect, where catastrophes can ripple across dimensions, where refugees from destroyed realities can cross over and try to build new lives. The valley is a crossroads, a place where multiple dimensions touch, where the consequences of ancient catastrophes play out, where the hope for healing and restoration remains possible. Every interaction with void-related content, every friendship with shadow people, every effort to understand rather than simply exploit or destroy, contributes to the long work of healing wounds that span dimensions and eras. The void catastrophe happened long ago, but its consequences live on, and how the present responds to those consequences will determine whether futures holds continued suffering or eventual peace and restoration. The future of the dwarves and shadow people, uncertain though it remains, holds possibilities that range from extinction to renewal. Every day that Krobus and the dwarf survive is another day their species persist. Every friendship formed, every peaceful interaction, every moment of choosing connection over isolation, builds toward futures that seemed impossible during the war. The question is not whether complete restoration is possible. It almost certainly is not. What was lost cannot be recovered. But the question is whether something new can be built from what remains, whether survivors can find purpose and meaning beyond simply surviving, whether the story can have chapters beyond tragedy. Krobus's journey from the sewers to potentially living on a surface farm represents the most radical reimagining of shadow people existence. If one shadow person can adapt so completely, can find peace and even happiness in circumstances so different from their original nature, what does that mean for shadow people identity? Are they still shadow people if they live in light, if they befriend physical beings, if they integrate into surface communities? Or have they become something new, transformed by adaptation into hybrid beings that bridge worlds? There is loss in this transformation, loss of pure connection to the void, loss of original cultural identity. But there is also gain, new experiences, new relationships, new possibilities that could never have existed in the void or in isolated underground refuges. The dwarf's path is different but parallel. They maintain closer connection to dwarven heritage by staying in the mines, surrounded by the remnants of their civilization. but they too are transforming through contact with the player and through the forced peace with Krobus. They are learning that their people's version of history is not the only version, that their enemies were also victims, that the war accomplished nothing worth its cost. This knowledge changes them, makes them something their ancestors during the war's height would not recognize. A dwarf who questions rather than simply hates. A dwarf who trades peacefully with humans and honors a magical seal preventing violence against shadow people. This too is transformation, perhaps less visible than Krobus's but equally significant. If other survivors exist in numbers sufficient to form communities, the transformations that Krobus and the dwarf represent could spread. They could serve as examples, proof that adaptation is possible, that peace with former enemies is survivable. Young dwarves and shadow people growing up hearing stories of Krobus and the dwarf's friendship with a human farmer might internalize different values than their parents' generation. They might ask different questions. Why do we hate them? Because they hurt us. But didn't we hurt them too? The war hurt everyone. So why would we continue it? This simple logic, obvious to outsiders but nearly impossible for those carrying generational trauma, might finally take root in new generations that have perspective their elders lack. The player's farm itself represents a vision of what peace could look like at larger scale. Different species and entities coexist there peacefully. Junimos in their huts help harvest crops. Krobus might live in the farmhouse. The dwarf trades and visits. Animals of many types share the same spaces. Everyone contributes according to their abilities and benefits according to their needs. It's a microcosm of functional, multicultural, multi-species community. Scaling this model to Pelican Town and beyond would require addressing larger structural issues, but the proof of concept exists. The farm shows it's possible. The spreading of this model faces obstacles both practical and psychological. Fear remains the primary barrier. Humans fear shadow people and dwarves as unknown, as potentially dangerous. Shadow people fear anyone who might be related to or allied with dwarves. Dwarves fear shadow people based on centuries of conditioning. These fears are not irrational given history. They are protective responses that kept their bearers alive. But they are also now maladaptive, preventing cooperation that would benefit everyone. Overcoming fear requires building trust incrementally, small successes that gradually demonstrate safety. Every peaceful interaction between the player and Krobus where Krobus is not hurt. Every trade with the dwarf where both parties honor the agreement. Every day Krobus lives on the farm without incident. These accumulate into evidence that contradicts fear narratives, slowly building alternate understanding. The economic incentive for peace is substantial but often overlooked. The dwarven technology and knowledge that still exists could benefit humans enormously if shared. Shadow people's understanding of void energy and dimensional mechanics could revolutionize magic and possibly technology. Human agricultural expertise and surface resources could help both underground species develop more sustainable lifestyles. Trade relationships create interdependence, and interdependence creates vested interest in maintaining peace. War disrupts trade, making everyone poorer. Peace enables prosperity. This mercenary logic might succeed where moral arguments fail. People who profit from peace are motivated to maintain it regardless of their feelings about former enemies. Education represents another critical pathway forward. The current generation of Pelican Town residents is largely ignorant of underground people's existence and history. This ignorance is protective in some ways, preventing transmission of old prejudices. But it also means humans are unprepared for contact, likely to respond with fear and violence when encounters occur. Deliberate education, starting with children who are most adaptable, could prepare future generations for multi-species coexistence. Teaching about dwarves and shadow people in schools, including their perspectives and histories, normalizes their existence. Children taught that shadow people are people rather than monsters will not automatically respond with violence when they encounter one. The museum's role in this education cannot be overstated. Gunther's collection of artifacts from Multiple civilizations provides physical evidence of rich non-human cultures. Properly contextualized exhibits explaining what these artifacts meant to their creators, how they were used, what they reveal about dwarven and shadow people values and capabilities, transforms the museum from cabinet of curiosities into educational institution. School field trips to the museum where children learn about the elemental wars, about the void catastrophe, about the complexity of history and the importance of peace, plant seeds that could grow into changed attitudes over decades. The role of art and culture in reconciliation deserves attention. If dwarven and shadow people cultures include music, visual art, storytelling, performance, sharing these with human communities creates emotional connections that pure facts cannot achieve. Imagine a festival in Pelican Town where Krobus teaches shadow people songs, where the dwarf demonstrates traditional dwarven crafts, where humans share their own cultural productions in return. Art bypasses intellectual defenses, speaks directly to emotions, builds empathy in ways that historical accounts struggle to match. Shared cultural celebration creates community across species lines. The spiritual dimension offers another bridge. Krobus worships Yoba despite being from the void. The dwarf, while their spiritual practices are less clear, lives in a world where Yoba worship is dominant. If both species can find place within Yoba mythology and worship, then the church becomes another site of potential unity. Shared religion has historically been double-edged, sometimes inspiring wars but also sometimes transcending other boundaries. If the church in Pelican Town welcomed shadow people and dwarves openly, treated them as fellow children of Yoba, it would make powerful statement about universal worth and belonging. The wizard's more esoteric magical practice offers similar potential for those not drawn to organized religion. Magic transcends species, accessible to any with talent and dedication. Mixed species magical study groups or covens could build bonds while advancing knowledge. The question of justice and reparations remains thorny but unavoidable if genuine reconciliation is to occur. Both dwarves and shadow people suffered immensely during the elemental wars. Both lost nearly everything, contemporary humans profiting from mining ruins of both. Civilizations creates moral debt. What would appropriate reparations look like? Financial compensation to survivors funded by mining taxes. Protected territories where underground peoples can live without interference. Political representation giving them voice in decisions affecting their interests. Public memorials acknowledging the wars and their casualties. Official apologies from human governments for post-war exploitation. These gestures cannot undo harm, but they acknowledge it, validate survivors' pain, and demonstrate commitment to doing better going forward. Genuine reconciliation would require truth and reconciliation processes similar to those used in human post-conflict situations. Creating spaces where survivors from all sides can tell their stories, express their pain, hear others' perspectives, begins the long work of processing collective trauma. Krobus needs space to speak about shadow people losses, to have those losses acknowledged as real and grievous. The dwarf needs the same for dwarven suffering. And importantly, both need to hear each other's stories, to understand that their pain is not unique, that the other side suffered equally. This does not erase responsibility or justify atrocities, but it complicates the narrative of pure victim and pure villain, moving toward recognition that the war was tragedy for everyone involved. The practical work of building peace infrastructure requires sustained effort over generations. Establishing diplomatic protocols for interspecies interactions, creating conflict resolution mechanisms for when disputes arise, developing translation services since language barriers complicate communication, building physical infrastructure like dedicated safe zones for species with different environmental needs, training peacekeepers who can intervene in potential conflicts before they escalate. All of this requires resources, political will, and most importantly, time. Peace is not event but process, not destination but journey. The seal of promise between Krobus and the dwarf is first step. Scaling to community-wide and eventually regional or global peace requires building on that foundation steadily, patiently, accepting setbacks while maintaining direction. The possibility of species decline and eventual extinction cannot be ignored. If Krobus and the dwarf are truly the last or among the last of their kinds, then their deaths mean extinction regardless of how well they adapt or how many friends they make. The genetics are against them if reproduction is not possible. This makes every moment of their continued existence precious and makes documentation of their knowledge urgent. Recording everything they know about their cultures, their histories, their technologies and magics ensures that even if the species die, their cultural legacy survives. This is cold comfort, but it is something. Future generations could learn from dwarven engineering principles even if no dwarves remain to practice them. Shadow people's understanding of dimensional mechanics could advance knowledge even if no shadow people survive to add to it. But perhaps extinction is not inevitable. Perhaps hidden populations exist in unexplored depths. Perhaps dwarven cities sealed behind collapsed tunnels contain thousands of survivors maintaining their civilization in isolation. Perhaps shadow people continue emerging from the void, new refugees from the ongoing catastrophe, ensuring population continuity even as individuals die. These are hopeful possibilities without conclusive evidence, but also without definitive refutation. The underground is vast. The Skull Cavern is endless. There is room for hidden populations, for civilizations that endure beyond the awareness of surface dwellers. Discovery of such populations would transform everything, turning Krobus and the dwarf from last survivors into first ambassadors. The broader implications for the Stardew Valley world of achieving genuine multi-species peace are transformative. A world where humans, dwarves, and shadow people coexist peacefully would be fundamentally different from the current situation. Technology would advance through shared knowledge. Magic would deepen through combined traditions. New art forms would emerge from cultural fusion. The economy would expand with new trading partners and new resources. The very landscape would change as different species work together to build infrastructure serving all rather than just surface dwellers. This is the positive vision, the best-case scenario toward which current small steps might eventually lead. But the path to that future is neither straight nor guaranteed. Setbacks will occur. Violent incidents between species will happen, threatening to restart old conflicts. Prejudiced individuals will resist change, will advocate for maintaining old boundaries and hierarchies. Economic interests vested in current arrangements will obstruct reforms. The work of peace will often feel thankless and futile. This is why the personal relationships matter so much. When larger peace efforts falter, the friendship between one human and one shadow person, between one player and one dwarf, demonstrates that individuals can maintain peace even when institutions fail. These relationships are both end unto themselves and seeds from which larger peace can grow when conditions improve. The story of the dwarves and shadow people is ultimately a story about consequences. The consequence of mutual incomprehension escalating to violence. The consequence of war consuming everything it touches. The consequence of trauma being transmitted across generations. But it is also a story about choices. Krobus choosing to seek friendship despite fear. The dwarf choosing to honor the seal of promise despite anger. The wizard choosing to intervene rather than let final violence occur. The player choosing to learn history rather than remain ignorant, to befriend rather than exploit, to see people rather than monsters or resources. These choices, small in themselves, accumulate into possibility of different futures. The mines will always be haunted by what happened there. The ruins will remain ruins. The lost civilizations will remain lost. The dead will not return. But the living can choose how to relate to this history. They can choose to treat it as justification for continued enmity, as proof that the other side is evil and must be opposed. Or they can choose to treat it as cautionary tale, as evidence of what must never happen again, as foundation for building something better. The valley, with its magic and its community and its cycles of growth and renewal, offers space for that better future to emerge. Not easily, not quickly, but possibly. In the end, the elemental wars teach that peace is always fragile, always requiring active maintenance, always threatened by fear and pain and historical memory. But they also teach that peace is always possible, even after the worst devastation, even between the bitterest enemies, even when all seems lost. As long as survivors remain who are willing to try, who are willing to see past their pain to recognize the pain of others, who are willing to choose connection over isolation and hope over despair, the possibility of peace survives. And that possibility, that small flickering flame in the deep darkness of the minds, is worth protecting, worth nurturing, worth building a life and a world around. Because the alternative, the endless cycle of violence and revenge and mutual destruction, leads only to silence. The silence of empty ruins, the silence of extinct civilizations, the silence of the void. And that silence, once achieved, can never be reversed. So the living choose moment by moment, day by day, to speak instead, to build instead, to connect instead, to choose life and light and peace, however difficult, however complicated, however uncertain the outcome. Because in the end, that choice is all that stands between existence and oblivion, between the possibility of futures and the certainty of ending. And as long as that choice remains possible, hope remains alive in the depths of Stardew Valley.